Hello, I'm Shanna Tan. I'm a Singaporean translator working from Korean, Chinese, and occasionally Japanese into English. So I translated the best-selling Welcome to the Dong bookshop by Hwang Bo-rum, which was published by Bloomsbury last year. And today I'll be reading an excerpt of my translation from the Singapore Literature Prize-winning work Dakota by Wong Koi Tet. And this book, my translation, was just published in Singapore, and I'm still looking for a US or UK publisher for this. And in one sentence, this is a literary, creative, non-fiction work about coming of age in the 1970s in an iconic Singapore neighborhood that is now lost to urban renewal. And it's a collection of vignettes and stories about everyday objects and happenings, such as a bottle of cod liver oil, monitor lizards in the storm drain, and a coffin in the living room. Today I'll be reading two excerpts, and they are both from the chapter My High-Tech Childhood. Okay, so this one is The VCR Player. We welcome a new addition to our home, a 960B VCR player from Sharp. Father and uncle wanted another brand when they put their money, but mother was adamantly against it, arguing that inferior machines were prone to overheating. They would ruin her tapes and discolor the features of her favorite stars, Chow Yun-fat and Carol Chang. Japan one can use 8 years or 10 years. Give birth to a kid also not so worth it, she retorted. Because our TV console was already crowded with an assortment of crockery and canned food, the VCR player was relegated to a cardboard mat on the floor. Sometimes we accidentally kicked it askew as we walked by. The power cables stretched upwards and hung across Tua Pei Gong's crown of Gual. They shared a power outlet and blessed our family with their presence. Mother binge-watched TVB dramas on the VCR. Father watched whatever she played, while uncle mostly rented tapes of American wrestling. My brother, the cat, and I weren't allowed to watch anything. Because I would usually flop at the table after dinner to do my homework, I took every opportunity to twist around or crane my neck to catch a glimpse of what was playing on the VCR, at least until a scolding eventually rained down on me. As a result, I only had a hazy idea of who was in love with whom, while having no problem belting out the opening theme song from start to finish. One night, I went to bed early despite not having memorized all the words on the spelling list for the next day's test. In the middle of the night, I started awake with a shiver, along with an urgent need for the toilet. Mother was snoring on the edge of the bed while her right leg, which was streaked with scaly skin for half her life, rested heavily across my brother's chest. I noticed a dim light floating in the darkness as I dashed out of the room, covering 3 steps in 2 strides. In front of the TV, father and uncle froze when they saw me. Panic flashed in their eyes, and they quickly shifted their gaze upward towards Tua Pei Gong. I slowed down, walked into the toilet, and put down my pants, not paying attention to where I was spraying, before finishing with a shake of the bum and getting ready to return to bed. Father and uncle were still frozen in position as I coolly walked past them, meeting their gaze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the cat snoozing by the wall, a man and woman moaning on the TV. As I lay back down on the bed, mother's snores changed to a different scale, and in my drowsiness, I felt a part of me leaking out. Suddenly, the words of childhood flashed in my mind, clear and complete. Okay, so the next one is called The Radio. Mother wanted a radio. After the Lunar New Year, she took some cash and brought me to an electronics shop in the neighborhood. I suspected a good chunk of the money had come from the red packets little brother and I had received during the festive season. Mother had taken them for safekeeping, claiming that she would help us deposit the money. As she zipped her purse shut, it felt like a sharp-toothed monster had swallowed our red packets whole. Mother said she brought me along because I would know more about technology. Not wanting to miss a rare opportunity to show off, I deliberately made a show of exclaiming, "Aya, nowadays nobody call it radio anymore lah." Mother screwed up her face doubtfully, but said nothing, perhaps thinking that her child had finally learned something useful in school. Having spent half her life yowling at people and objects, the edges of her mouth were lined with deep creases as she awkwardly spat out the two syllables hi-fi in the following fourth tone. This one got dual cassette decks and dual speakers and an antenna that can reach the sky. The boss of the electronics shop touted his merchandise, his flying spit landing a hair's breadth from my face. He emphasized that the model was imported from the West. "Come from Holland one," he exclaimed. The scorching and humid afternoon was the perfect weather for hard bargaining, and each time the boss swiped away beads of sweat with his handkerchief, the price went down by a little more. We lugged the radio home and each person holding up one side as mother went on about how it was from Holland one, Holland one. But when she tried to pronounce the label on the box, the two syllables sounded nothing like the sounds I knew. Unviewed from its box, the new radio was displayed on the dining table, its sleek metallic body more heavenly than Tua Pei Gong on the altar. Mother brought out a cassette tape from her room, a present from fifth aunt during the New Year. On the cover, an angelic singer posed in a festive red cheongsam. Out of the 6 printed characters, I only recognized the ones for bird and moon. 20 years on, it still takes me a while to figure out which button to push on the radio. No, not the Holland import. That one lasted barely a few years before it broke down, around the same time our cat left home and never came back. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this.
Hi, I'm Megan Sungyoon, and this is a bilingual reading of Kim Yurim's poem 꿈의 꿈, or Dream of Dream, from her poetry collection 세계 이상의 모형, or More Than Three Figure. Kim Yurim will read the original Korean first, and I'll follow her by reading my English translation. Kim Yurim is the author of poetry collections 양방향, bidirectional, 세계 이상의 모형, a more than three figure, and 별세계, another star. She is the winner of the 2016 Contemporary Poetry's Emerging Poets Award. In attempts to produce texts without being confined to a particular genre, Kim Yurim has also worked on various projects including her forthcoming novel 재미 공작소를 위한 한 가지 지도, One Map for Studio 재미, 2 autobiographical texts, and small press My Moon.
꿈의 꿈. 간 사람은 돌아와. 그러나 간 사람을 찾으러 갔던 사람은 돌아오지 않는다. 그래도 나무가 있고 나무가 있다. 나무가 있는데 또 나무가 보인다. 그만하고 싶지만 나무가 있고 나무가 있다. 그만하고 싶어도 나무는 그만하지 않고 시청에서 고용한 인부들이 심은 그 자리에서 움직이지 않고 있다. 가로수는 가로수지만 나무는 나무다. 사람들이 지나가고 나무가 있고 사람들이 지나가도 나무가 있다. 나무가 없어도 있어도 간 사람은 돌아오고 간 사람을 찾으러 갔던 사람은 이상하지 돌아오지 않는다. 사람은 거기서 가정을 꾸리고 외국어로 말한다. 그래도 나무가 있고 나무가 있다. 사람은 그래도 나무가 있고 나무가 있는 서울의 거리에서 나처럼 걷는다. 이렇게.
Dream of dream. Gone one comes back. But one went to look for the gun, doesn't. Still, there's tree, and there's tree, there's tree. But there appears tree again, though I want to stop there's tree, and there's tree. Though I want to stop, tree doesn't stop, standing where the workers, hired by the city hall, planted it. A street tree is a street tree, but tree is tree. There's tree, though people walk by, with or without tree. Gone one comes back, and one who went to look for the gone, isn't it weird, does not come back. There, one makes oneself home and speaks in another language. Still, there's tree, and there's tree. Still, one, there's tree, and on the streets of Seoul, where there's tree, walks like me, like this.
Hi everyone, my name is Stine. I'm a poet and translator based in New York City. I'm so excited to be reading for the festival this year with my friend and fellow translator Jein. We first met as mentees in the Alta Emerging Translator Mentorship Program a few years ago, and since then we've been meeting online regularly to workshop and to talk about translation, poetry, and life. We're delighted to be sharing some of our work with you today. We'll each introduce the poets and the collections we're working on, and then we'll take turns reading from our work. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jein.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, my name is Jein Han. I translate from and into Korean. I'll be reading from Lee Min-ho's first collection of poems, Phantom Limbs, that was published by Munji in 2005. Lee Min-ho is a Korean poet who began her career in 2000 and has published 5 collections of poetry since. She's the recipient of many awards, including the Ji-hoon Award and Sanghwa Award, 2 awards named after 2 major Korean poets. What I love about Lee Min-ho's poetry is that she reminds you that poems are spells and incantations. I hope you enjoy them as much as I do.
And I'll be reading some translations of poems by Heekyung from his first poetry collection, 오늘 아침 단어, published by Munji Books in 2011. I've translated the title as Today's Morning Vocabulary. Yu is a South Korean poet, playwright, and essayist, and the author of 7 collections of poetry and prose. Born in Seoul in 1980, Yu studied creative writing with poet Kim Hye-soon at the Seoul Institute of the Arts and playwriting at the Korea National University of Arts. In 2019, Yu was awarded the Hyundai Munaksang Contemporary Literature Award for his poetry. He also runs Wit and Cynical, my favorite poetry bookshop and project space in the world, and I hope you'll visit the next time you're in Seoul.
Wit and Cynical is the best poetry bookshop in Seoul. I really hope you visit there as well. And with that, I'll read the first poem. It's called H. H. M is for my name. H is for your name, my name. Blue-backed snare, sharp oxygen. Gasping for air, I went to Lustrous June's flesh market to sell the apricot-colored uvula caught in my throat, but then it came back as a mustard-yellow cloud, but then, don't cry, don't cry, your tears are glass fins that will never decay. M is for mortal, H is for hyoid. M is for warning, H is for heaven. When my grave pulls at the end of its stream, would you please bloom into a single red rumor? Would you protect me so I won't die when I'm dead?
K. The person who had been standing by the window is K. Despite our eyes meeting, there seemed to be no intention to retreat from or fend off my gaze. Outside the window, the wind was blowing as if to fall on its back. Barely containing myself of that time, I thought I envied gray-haired Kay, because to me that time seemed so distant. Expired sunbeams burn up. The burnt cannot come into existence ever again. Let's say that is why I wanted to steal Kay's gray glimmering gaze, because I cannot recall that time. Even to imagine it is strenuous. It is like a window, a well-dusted, bright window frame. That time, the textured crinkling of brown paper bags, the smell of cheap food that used to waft out from within, holding the paper bag, my eyes opening wide, the darkness thickening, midnight that almost smells burnt, that time when solicitors shroud the streets and the neon signs glow at their brightest. I cannot know what Kay was thinking. That unhinges me. K is dreaming, and that is also my stance for thinking about K. To be standing outside all conceivable reactions, the place of the lightest weight where I was taken. 1,000 butterflies invented K. Therefore, as ever, wings. The heat glowing from wings heaps on, the place where K vanished. Only a fever remains, blazes, that time. Burnt up K cannot stand again in that place. Wavering K is not K, but is truly that K is.
You with your glasses off. What a beautiful sight. We've only brushed past once, but your onion eyes are easy on my eyes. The mushy flesh of time endlessly squeezing out juice is easy to bore and gouge. You take off your glasses, and I take off my windows. You unzip your pants, and I unzip my stairs. You spread your legs, and I spread my landing strip. You stick out your tongue, and I stick out my airplane. You mount my body, and I mount the cloud forest. In the cloud forest, limpid green mountains grow upside down, and fetuses with oranges screwed in for eyes swarm in every valley, while the screams of 500-year-old beasts crumble and float like soft flour. Breathless, while sprinting the 1,000-mile track from head to toe with hoofs of your whole body, you have your glasses off. My body shreds and flutters like leaves of an ash tree. I fly far beyond the cloud forest. My dry flesh endlessly tearing and floating is good for licking the bridge of your nose. I am lighter than glass. Try me on. Go ahead and smile. You with your glasses off. Your onion eyes are easy on my eyes.
Erasable map. When night arrives, I study my own ways to become a desert. To grow old even faster, I walk slowly and walk backwards, turning around suddenly to remember someone I tried to forget, aching a little. A map is like an animal that grows in fragments. I consider my arid career of tearing open envelopes, although when I see the symbol called father, I think about playing catch. And before you know it, 20,000 hectares or so of playing field grows between me and father. Every now and then I plant seeds the size of pill halves in secret, but nothing grows. His back turned to the wind that just blew in. My saddened young self runs to pick up the ball. Who are you? Whose hide is this glove made of? And why do I start wanting to shout when I see an object in flight? A little girl chases her older brother, and the cries she detonates ring round and round into the evening, an evening where you hold your breath until you can't take another. Perhaps the pattern of life is like that, like wrinkles on tightly closed lips. But the dead don't throw anything. The red sun crosses over to open the heart of a path ripened into a hardness that refuses to open. It's been ages since I erased the way of sprinting to catch like this.
Story. There was a ginkgo tree that shouldered the 1,000-year-old sky, but then, between its dense branches slung a yellow bus. But then, when I locked eyes with the yellow bus, it dipped down onto the fishnet road. But then, I got on the bus. But then, a bird with blue beaks was steering the wheel. But then, the bus dragged its bulging stomach as it crawled on all fours across the void. But then, I folded the long neck of a woman craning out the window and shoved it into my suitcase before slowly unloading myself on a chair. But then I peered into the bus map painted on the bird's wing. But then all I saw was a cluster of frog spawn eyeballs. But then briefly the doors would open and people would get on to hand over their suitcases. But then each time I would snap the longest neck craning farthest out from its window and shove it in a suitcase. But then children hanging their necks from every ginkgo branch shrieked with laughter. But then the toy stores had all covered their ears. But then the bird with blue beaks wouldn't let go of the steering wheel. But then 10 years went by as I threw each suitcase out the window, looking for a place to get off. But then snags in the countless meshes of the road would go unnoticed. But then the yellow paint on the bus wouldn't even fade. But then there is no end to the story. But then
Falling inside. The time of the hair-streaked butterfly fluttering away as a tiger butterfly. The time of sitting with my back turned. The time of a day's sun before its heat. The time of dust dividing and drifting away its numbers. The time of dandelion seeds floating up and sinking and floating up again. The time of my aching eyes straining to see farther. The time of the houses stretching out far away one by one until they disappear. The time that won't arrive. The time of snow slowly falling inside the soju bottle. The time of ressentiment. The time of trees locking up their shadows. The time of feeling enough time has passed while fearing that time will stop. The time that at any rate doesn't pass easily. The time of turning back again with a sigh, of snow falling still inside the soju bottle, of not yet being drunk, of my still aching eyes, of explaining away even the things too far away to see. The time that is you, the time that isn't you, the time that isn't me thinking of you, the time of discarding myself as such, the time that breaks, the time that melts, the time that blows away, the time that dissolves, the time of snow no longer falling inside the soju bottle, the time when there are no butterflies and only violets remain, the time of leaving behind the violets and returning, the time of no longer being there, the time when only time remains, when even time can barely stand to leave itself, that time.
mirror game 1. Why don't you wedge yourself between the mirror and the glass pane? Sunlight rolls like a hard-boiled egg outside the window. Your body's wetland is revealed to be neither light nor dark. Why don't you stick a fin into your heel and stretch your left eye? Ripples roll across the mirror. Why don't you push your right eye deeper and deeper and deeper into the mirror's quivering flesh? Why don't you shove your two eyes into the mirror and gasp out your gills? The mirror's wrenching grasp. Salmon roe gushes like water from open faucets. 2. Go ahead and push your whole body into the tepid mirror. 9 drawers open from your sack of flesh, and from each one opens 9 smaller drawers that rattle. Flip over and lie on your stomach. From your armpits, 54 guitar strings grow out and twang. They'll pick the ears. Cut off your ears and place them in a drawer before gently closing it. The drawers will start jiggling again. Out of a drawer, a canary's head peeks out halfway. You can shut it as fast as you can, but the stench won't fade. The odor will sting your eyes. Open the drawer bulging with erasers. Why don't you feed it your 2 ears? 3. Why don't you use your right hand to stretch out your left arm and escape the mirror? Why don't you use your longer left arm to climb up the wall and stop the clock's hands? When you climb down, you'll find mother grown into a palm tree. Plum-colored sex organs dangle from each branch. You'll pluck an oozy one and bite in. You'll drop it. A plum-colored sunset tumbles down to your window. See how it's squashed under the wheels of racing cars. See how salmon rose surges like water from fountains. See how it endlessly climbs up the outer wall. Why don't you draw the black curtain and dive back into the mirror? Why don't you climb the wall with your right hand and wind the clock? Go back and lie inside the mirror. The drawers are all falling deep into sleep. Can you see the mirror's torn flesh closing up as it devours you?
Boy Ivan. To Ivan, who woke up early this morning, the kitchen was like a windless bamboo forest, silent. Father, the face he left behind when picked up, was cold like a dropped razor blade. The day was waning. Ivan found an ear. Late at night, sitting on a secluded bench in the playground, he tilted the ear to the sound of his own crying, was endlessly listening. Every morning, Ivan's cry-jangling ears heard a sound from his younger brother's back, headed to work, a sound as if something sparkly was sparkling. Ivan shaved his face. Mother became a spacious grove of silver grass. Ivan became a swamp beneath her feet. Except for this, there's no other way to describe restless mother. The more time passed, a dull, ordinary crying clung to the ear through unknowable effort. Accordingly, Ivan holds for his own ear a boundless pride. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jein.
Hello and happy St. Jordi 2024 to all of you. I'm poet and translator AK. You can find me published under AKaiser. And I have the pleasure today to be accompanied by prize-winning Catalan poet Ana Gual to share with you some of her work in Catalan and in my English language translations. You can also find this work in previous years' SANT JORDI Festival USA recordings, in Circumference, in the Harvard Review, Hyperion, Poetry, and soon as part of the upcoming European Literary Festival. First, a word about the force of Anna's work. She has demonstrated a talent for expressing contemporary and timeless life in all its unexpectedness. Whether she was exploring, excavating, if need be, relationships among human beings and the rest of our universe, between and within bodies, or in the flesh and blood of language itself. Poets and critics have called her work a territory of continuous exceptionalities. That to enter her work is to enter a forest of wild rebirths. Poet Gemma Gorgia describes Gual's poetic world as one where human laws are far away. For me, I think Beckett, I think Pizarnik, I think Vivi Francis, I think the exceptional and unique Ana Gual. We will read 3 poems today, one from Anna's most recent book, Las Ocultations, working title in English, Hidden Things, and 2 from Unnamable, for which I was awarded an NEA Translation Fellowship. Anna?
És un plaer participar en aquesta iniciativa tan bonica. El primer poema que llegiré es diu La passió, i la passió, si va d'una cosa, és justament de la passió que tenim moltes persones al voltant dels llibres i de la literatura, i com pot això afectar, doncs, a la vida. Llegia llibres, comprava llibres, Subratllava llibres, doblegava les pàgines dels llibres, anava a la biblioteca i demanava llibres, acariciava llibres, es masturbava amb llibres. Escrivia sobre llibres, passejava amb llibres, s'adormia amb llibres, somiava que escrivia llibres, es despertava i escrivia els llibres. De vegades només feia veure que escrivia llibres. Enviava llibres, rebia a casa llibres, deixava llibres, reclamava els llibres, intercanviava llibres, es feia una taula amb llibres, dormia damunt de llibres, esmorzava, dinava i sopava amb llibres. Perdia llibres. De vegades trobava els llibres. Omplia llibretes amb frases de llibres i dibuixava llibres als marges de les llibretes que contenien frases de llibres. Al llit de mort, davant l'absència de llibres, li insistien: «No en vols cap de llibre?» I ell feia que no amb el cap, somrient, i amb les mans girava el full del llibre final.
The Passion. He read books, bought books, underlined books, dog-eared pages of books, went to the library and took out books, caressed books, masturbated with books, wrote on books, strolled with books, fell asleep with books, dreamt of writing books, woke up and wrote books, sometimes only pretended to write books, sent books, received books at the house, left books, reclaimed the books, exchanged books, made a table with books, slept on books, ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner with books, lost books, sometimes found books, filled notebooks with passages from books, and drew books in the margins of the notebooks that were full of passages from books. On his deathbed, faced with the absence of books, they insisted, "Don't you want even one book?" And he shook his head, smiling, and with his hand turned the page of the final book.
Fantàstic. El següent poema que llegirem es diu L'ocult natural i és un poema que vaig escriure després d'un viatge, doncs, llarg en el temps, al Marroc, en què van passar, doncs, moltes coses. I aquest poema és el que clou el llibre L'ésser solar, que està també a Innombrable. L'ocult natural. Han estat moments increïbles, aquests. He vist morir un home i he vist matar-ne d'un cop sec un altre. N'he vist plorar sanglots uns quants. N'he vist bastants que al carrer sagnaven. Si torno, és perquè necessito contemplar en primera persona un naixement. Poder notar, a flor de pell, com un forat escup un cos i dels grumolls en surt un ser amb 2 micropulmons i 2 minicames. Saber que passarà els dies respirant i desplaçant-se, movent-se, cercant en va una llista de coses estables. Però no dir-li res, callar-li l'esventada, silenciar el vent huracanat, la força del corrent, els terratrèmols, els dilubis, les sotragades. Somriure al fill, prémer fort la mà de la mare.
Lovely. The Natural Occult. Well, this poem was published along with others as the featured work in Harvard Review's online Omniglat series in July 2022. The Natural Occult. Some incredible moments these have been. I have seen a man die, and I have seen one kill another with one blow. I've seen some sob, and many others bleed in the streets. If I go back, it's because I need to contemplate in the first person of birth. To sense with a shiver how a whole spits out a body, and from lumps come a being with 2 micro lungs and 2 mini legs. To know she'll spend days breathing and repositioning, moving, searching in vain, a list of stable things. But say nothing to her. Hush the chatter. Silence the hurricane wind, the force of the current, the earthquakes, the floods, the shocks. Smile at the child. Squeeze hard the mother's hand.
Doncs acabarem, oi, aquest petit recital amb Viatge interior, que és el tercer poema, i apareix en el meu primer llibre, publicat el 2008, que es diu Implosions, i després apareix també en el recull Innombrable. Viatge interior. No ho diguis a ningú. M'he empassat la pedra que m'ha fet caure i he alçat el cos aprofitant un cop de vent. Si em moc, és gràcies al dolor que em llisca a sòfec avall, fetge avall, estómac avall, intestí gros avall, abdomen avall, genolls avall, víscera endins. Que per què escric? Perquè no sé parlar ni em vull aprendre.
And this third poem was published in Poetry, June 2023, the same month where Anna and I were presenting our work with Carlow University at Trinity College, Dublin, on Bloom's Day. Inner Journey. Don't tell anyone. I have swallowed the stone that has made me fall, and I've lifted my body up, taking advantage of a gust of wind. If I move, it's thanks to the pain that slips to my esophagus below, my liver below, stomach below, large intestine below, abdomen below, knees below, viscera inside. Why do I write? Because I don't know how to speak, and I don't want to learn. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you everyone for being here and listening to our poems today.
Gràcies a tots. Ha estat molt bonic. Bon Sant Jordi a tothom. Ai, Sant Jordi.
A Fish in Ice by Ricardo Piglia. Emilio Renzi was at a sidewalk bar on the Piazza Carlo Felice in front of the Turin station early in the morning when he saw her. It couldn't be. Ines was there at a table nearby with the white-haired guy, with the white-haired jerk who had taken her to Europe. She was wearing the blue outfit Emilio gave her and smiled beautifully in the summer glare. She noticed him in turn, incredulous and a little irritated, as if she thought Emilio was following her. And he had, of course, been following her in his imagination ever since the evening Ines left him and went off for good while he told her, "Stay, let's get married." Several months had gone by, and now Emilio was in Italy with a grant to study the works of Pavese. He had been looking for an excuse to escape Buenos Aires, to stop thinking about her and forget her. He now had her in front of him, however, seated in the shade of the colorful umbrellas. The thing most feared in secret always happens. What was she doing in Turin? As if she'd read his thoughts, the girl made a questioning gesture at him, then stood and went into the bar. But before passing through the seating area, she turned to look at him with an expression of annoyance that he knew well. Emilio followed her and went inside. He didn't see her. The restrooms were downstairs next to the telephones. There were stairs and then a hallway that vanished in the dark. She wasn't there either. He left the seating area and returned to the stifling heat of the street. Everything was dreamlike. Neither she nor the white-haired man were at the bar. They had left in a hurry. Perhaps they'd thought he was going to make trouble. Had she told the white-haired man the truth? That guy over there is Emilio, and he followed me here from Buenos Aires. The empty table, the money lying on a metal tray, 2 beers. When she lived with him, she hardly ever drank beer, even less in the morning. There was a train ticket on the floor. Ferrovia Nazionale, Roma Torino. Had they come by train? Then why was there only a single fare? He knew what was happening, but couldn't manage to regain his composure. He ran into acquaintances everywhere he went. Arriving in Italy, he immediately saw Roberto Rossi, a friend from La Plata, on the street in Rome. It was incredible that he should be in Italy, and Emilio went over to greet him, happy to see him. Rossi was conversing animatedly with an older gentleman. Emilio came up alongside them, but it was not him. Much confusion, quick apologies. 2 days later, on the train to Turin, he saw another friend exit the dining car. It was Mario. Emilio stood, smiling, and Mario passed down the aisle as if he were invisible. We all have a double, he began to believe. On another continent, the world is a mirror and everything is duplicated, but elsewhere. A woman, just like Ines, with the white-haired man, was too much of a coincidence. 2 doubles, the same on the other side of the globe. It couldn't be, he raved. Seized by a mimetic impulse, he was seeing repetitions everywhere. Everything was a simulacrum. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Maybe that was it. Or maybe he was right, and pretty soon he would come across someone who was him. Curly hair, glasses, face of a sleepwalker. And then he knew what happened to people who met their doppelganger. He sat back down at the table. He looked for his notebook with the black cover. He had to put this out of mind and focus on his work. In this story, the collective unconscious can be seen in the way a textual fragment from the past comes to light out of an individual unconscious in the present. Through fragmentary quotations, a young writer strains to grasp the pressure that certain unseen forces exert on him. At the most intimate and private level, A Fish in Ice shows Piglia adopting his mother's gaze in the guise of Emilio Renzi to look at his father in the guise of Cesare Pavese. The reader is a party to what D.H. Lawrence called the flow of our sympathetic consciousness, the transference of emotive intellect that projects a reader into the life of an imaginary person. In this story, the flow is doubled. The reader reads about a fictional character who reads the works and biography of a person who really existed. The reader reads about Renzi, who reads about Pavese. As Renzi reads, Piglia's depiction of sympathetic consciousness moves between a fictional protagonist and a historical figure. This flow represents Renzi's attempt to understand himself. Out of fragments of Pavese's texts, Renzi constructs a narrative. He himself, the texts, and the narrative altogether form a circuit in his consciousness, unbroken by anything from outside that consciousness. Consistent with itself, Renzi's narrative about Pavese is a closed system, even if a non-system is all it is. The narrative, the closed system, is a model of the world. Unlike the real world, the world of the model is stable. Its stability comes from the permanence of the fragments Renzi has shored up to comfort and protect him. The intertextuality of A Fish in Ice is a metaphor for the experience of a generation that clutches at monumental artworks from the past, props them up as a barricade against the present, and panics when the threat of violence shows its face through them. The terror of culture is the basic condition of Piglia's fiction, as seen in this story. The oppressive atmosphere of dread in Argentina in the early 70s animates A Fish in Ice with a dark spirit. The story depicts an Argentine milieu that suffocates its members with a pressure unlocalized in any single cause or effect. This sense of menace everywhere and nowhere pervades the social environment and poisons the most ordinary interactions. For Piglia, telling is not an Adamic passion, the baptism of a newly discovered reality, Juan Villoro writes, but rather an ironic attitude, the exercise of an intelligence that disorganizes the collections and the 1,000 times visited rooms of the museum. In other words, Piglia deals in myth. Several entries in the diaries of Emilio Renzi, the Happy Years, suggest that Piglia meant A Fish in Ice to deal with myth, but none of them says how he understood this aspect of the piece. A mythic dimension emerges from the story's fictional treatment of the subject of reading. By telling a story about reading, the text of A Fish in Ice interposes between reader and story a distance in which reading itself is thematized and conceptualized. The cultural assumptions implicit in the kinds of reading that take place in the story, Piglia's or the reader's reading and Renzi's, are a matter of narratives collaboratively constructed and communally held to be true, hence also a matter of group cohesion. Ways of reading, therefore, are myths. A Fish in Ice contains a first-order myth and a second-order myth. Both are ways of reading, each of which rests on the assumptions that underpin it. The two myths correspond to two ways of reading Pavese. Each response to Pavese is typified by a critical interpretation. In the first-order myth, Renzi's way of reading Pavese no longer comports with the conditions of his life, but stagnates, an anachronism. This reading is an object, a particle in a grammar of signification that escapes Renzi but captivates him. The reading reads Renzi, you might say. Susan Sontag spells out this type of reading in her 1964 essay, The Artist as Exemplary Sufferer, in which she reads Pavese to discover the making of works of art and the venture of sexual love as the two most exquisite sources of suffering. To put it another way, afloat between the wish that what is told be true and the belief that it is not, as Alberto Manguel describes the polarities of reading, Renzi drifts toward wishful thinking in his reading of Pavese. This is the first-order myth. The second-order myth is to the first-order myth as the first-order myth is to the oeuvre and life of Pavese. The second-order myth deconstructs the first-order myth. Narrating Renzi's interpretation of Pavese, Piglia articulates the tacit mythic content that pervades Renzi's consciousness, nameless, thus everywhere and nowhere, and thereby simultaneously exposes the historical character of material that presents itself as natural and establishes a new position that goes beyond the old. That new position, the second-order myth, corresponds to the way Pavese's contemporary Alberto Moravia reads him. In Moravia's 1959 story Furniture Legs, a man named Alfredo invests his inheritance in an apartment in Rome and puts it up for rent. The Americans will like this view, he says, but I wouldn't live here for a single day. An American painter named Lee moves in, and Alfredo becomes fascinated with her because she remained a child in spite of being a woman. It was a strange mixture which aroused my interest, a new sensation which left me in a state of uncertainty and always with the desire to repeat it. Lee trashes the flat and leaves town owing 4 months' rent. It is hard not to read this story as an allegory for Pavese's brief and disastrous affair with the American movie actress Constance Dowling. In the words of Umberto Eco in his 1980 essay, The American Myth in Three Anti-American Generations, the story Furniture Legs dramatizes the experience of Italians who, for different historical and political reasons, somehow considered themselves, or ought to have considered themselves, anti-American, and who in some way on their own, working against, or indeed even in support of their anti-American ideology, created an American myth. Moravia's interpretation of Pavese pertains to a fish in ice, not because Piglia followed him, but because, unlike Sontag, Moravia and Pavese share a common circumstance. Moravia described the climate of interpretation surrounding Pavese in countries where, among literary people, American power asserted itself in works of literature more subtly than in movies and soft drinks. In several passages of his autobiography, Moravia elaborates his critique of Pavese as a writer of lyrical prose in a neo-realist mode, who borrowed the worst faults of the Americans and experienced not travel, but the myth of travel, the myth of America, for example. While Piglia was writing A Fish in Ice, the Argentine military junta lurked just around the corner, a period of state terror facilitated by the United States government via a clandestine program codenamed Operation Condor, active also in Paraguay, Chile, Uruguay, and elsewhere. Written in 1970 and published in 2006, A Fish in Ice occupies two distinct periods. First, the era of Cold War dissemination of ideology via public relations, advertising, and consumer products for export. And second, the first decade of the 21st century, our current era of aestheticized socio-political life, global disinformation, and the deregulation of publicly subsidized multinational telecommunications conglomerates. In late capitalist society, intentions of the historical avant-garde are being realized, wrote Peter Berger in 1974, but the result has been a disvalue. The literary voice of the American myth camouflaged Operation Condor by allowing intellectuals to be favorably disposed to the United States, since myths can be manufactured in the same sense and according to the same methods as any other modern weapon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Antoni Pizà. I'm the director of the Foundation for Iberian Music at the City University of New York. And I have the great pleasure today to be able to talk with a person I've known for a while, and I'm a great admirer, and I have a great respect for his work. He is Hayk Arsenyan. He is a pianist and a scholar. He has a PhD from the University of Iowa, and he recently published a book based on his dissertation, which is called, the dissertation I believe is called The Worlds of Antonio Soler, and the book is translated into Spanish, published by Editorial Gual, and the translation is El Mundo de Antonio Soler, straightforward translation. And anyway, Hayk, good to see you. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for hosting me. It's been a while, and it is great to see you. Although over Zoom, but I think we got used to this format also during the pandemic. But I really look forward to seeing you back in New York City, hopefully soon.
Yes,
so thank you very much for
forward to an in-person meeting. And by the way, today is March the 27th, 2024, because you never know when anyone might watch this, if anyone will watch it. I hope they do. So this is not COVID. We're still doing COVID things, but it's not the COVID period. Anyway, to the point, tell us a little bit. You are a pianist. Mostly, you're a composer also, and you're also a scholar. You have a PhD in musicology, and you dedicated your thesis, your doctoral dissertation to Antonio Soler. But tell us a little bit about your musical background. How did you get this? And also, we could segue into how did you get started with Antonio Soler?
Yes, I'm a pianist. I'm a composer. I started my musical journey as a violinist, in fact. And after more than 10 years of violin, but of course, parallelly also playing the piano and composing, I decided to concentrate on the piano. Still kept composing, and I still compose. I'm a member of the composers unions in France and in Armenia. And I have several works published as a composer, but I am mostly pianist, and I teach. So I used to teach at NYU for 9 years. Now I'm teaching mostly privately, and I also travel and give master classes. And master classes are on, of course, on any music, or whatever the students at the universities present. But I really love working on Spanish and Catalan and 18th century, especially so early music. This is sort of my specialty, and something that I fell in love with absolutely accidentally. Not with early music. I've always loved early music, but when I was doing my master's in Moscow and was at the library looking for something new in terms of early music to present, and I was going through alphabetically. Somehow after Froberger there was Soler. It was misplaced, and I took the Froberger because I loved it. And then Soler, I didn't even know what it was. And just, going through the book, I was like, this is very, very interesting. I'm taking this home as well. And so after looking at the first volume of Marvin's actually edition, I fell in love with it, and I absolutely included it in my program. And this was back in, I want to say, in 1999 or 2000, something like that. This is like 24, 25 years ago. And since then, I have played a lot of Soler sonatas. And back in 2008, 2007, when I was already choosing a topic for my dissertation, I understood this is the one. This is the music that I've been playing so much. I would like to even deeper into it. And what better way to do than research for your PhD, because this is where you really have to dig deeper. And so that's what happened. And I compiled a performance guide to Soler's sonatas, and the whole point was how to perform the sonatas on the modern instrument rather than historical instrument, but keeping the pertinence of style, the historical style. And this is something to make sure that I prolong the life and give more popularity, more exposure to the life of this music, the life of early music, that is not necessarily performed and should not only be performed on the historical instruments. I think there is, of course, that movement of, historical instruments should be, historical music should be performed only on historical instruments. I think I don't really support that. I think we need to give as much light and as much exposure and as much performance opportunities to the beautiful music, whatever era it is from, as possible. Me, like, being an Armenian and playing, music of a region that is quite remote from Armenia, is, again, it's all about giving performance opportunities and exposure opportunities, and unifying the world in a way, the cultural world.
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite remarkable, your story. So you encountered Soler in Moscow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
by mistake, because a terrible librarian had left the scores of Soler next to those of Froberger, I think, or something like that. Yeah. So F and S really don't follow each other. But anyway, it was a chance, and I think we're all lucky that you had that chance encounter. Now, Soler, you mentioned that one of the things that you're Soler, one of the things that you're trying to do and you're being successful at doing is that you want to play Soler in the modern piano, but you want to keep some of the stylistic features that probably were heard in an old keyboard instrument. Well, here, one of the issues is what instrument did Soler write these sonatas for? Do we know that? And what do you do to transfer that sound to the modern piano?
Wonderful question. Do we know that? This is really a question that is almost rhetorical, because we don't really know that, not only about Soler's use of pianofortes, but even up to Mozart, even up to late Mozart, we can really tell whether this music was written specifically for the harpsichord or the pianoforte. Pianoforte was around. Pianoforte was around in the Spanish court as well, and in fact, Spanish harpsichord maker Francisco Mirabel also made pianofortes in Spain, and there was also the Antunes piano pianos in Lisbon, in Portugal. The Cristofori replicas, right? There was the Stern piano in Germany. So those are all pianofortes that were in the course to the availability of those composers. And at some point, composers they kept they stopped specifying whether this was written for harpsichord or clavichord or pianoforte. They just wrote for keyboard. So a lot of the times it was also for the performers, choice. And a lot of this music was written also for their royal patrons. So whatever the patron, decided to play on. And Soler's patron was Don Gabriel, Gabriel de Bourbon, who was a very, very important sponsor and supporter of musicians, music. And it's incredible. I mean, he collected musical instruments. He had the strangest and the rarest, instruments in his collection. He built, this little palace called Casita de Arriba, right on the
Casita de
hill,
Arriba.
right near El Escorial, where he kept all of those keyboard instruments. And so I mean, of course, we can get into details about this, but the music, I can tell as a performer that some sonatas are intended to be performed on pianoforte, and some probably more like on harpsichord. And you can tell by the techniques that he is using. Some of the big octave, movements is just not going to sound right on the harpsichord. You can clearly tell that this is for pianoforte. In some other kind of passages, you can tell that he really, really wanted to have this percussive harpsichord sound, and that's what he intended. So how do we play that music on the modern instruments? That's also a great question. Now, when we are playing Bach, do we use pedal or do we not use pedal? So this is almost like the same kind of a question. Well, for example, Andras Schiff, whom I adore, and especially his Bach, he doesn't use the pedal, but he doesn't use the pedal not to make a point. The way that he doesn't use pedal, you don't even notice that he doesn't use pedal. I remember when I was at his concert, his performance in Chicago of Goldberg Variations, I discovered suddenly, meet through the performance, that he's not using pedal. So he did not made a point. It was just he was finding that sonority through not using the pedal, but doing his own way, his own touch, and his own timbres. I think that Bach, if he had the instrument that we have now that has pedals, he would not ignore the pedals, and he would not ignore the capacities that this instrument is offering. And I think same for Soler, and especially knowing how experimental and how forward thinking and what an inventor mind he had, I am sure he would not ignore this immense capacity that this instrument offers, and he would definitely use pedal and use all of it. Now, the question of authenticity, that's again something that really comes into this whole discussion. What is authentic? If I don't use pedal and if I don't use the capacity that this instrument offers, and I play only, let's say, at a church or in a European old mansion, pretending to be in a court, is this, or in a monastery, is this making it authentic performance? Not really. How authentic are we? How authentic are our ears at this point? Do we really have recordings of Soler playing? No, we don't. There are so many manuscripts, and the manuscripts are so diverse. Many of the manuscripts don't even have dates. All the opus numbers, all the catalog is all mixed up. many of his works are lost. In fact, a very, very cool collection of sonatas that was called Cuadro Libro in all 12 major and minor keys that was written, by Soler is lost. I mean, this composer was very, very forward thinking. And with all of this, I think performer is encountering this challenge of having the freedom, but also the challenge of the authenticity and keeping the pertinent style that we are informed by education. So I think that doing a deep research, and not just only Soler, but in Iberian music, and not only just Iberian music, but in early music in general, really helps us use that freedom, that artistic creativity in a more informed, authentic, as authentic as we have the right to use that word sense. So kind of combine and maybe face that challenge this way. Like Alicia de la Rocha, and I mentioned that in my book as well, says about this music, that there is no just one way of performing this music, and she was a big advocate of Soler's music, and one of the very few musicians who performed Soler. Unfortunately, Soler is still not performed. I was just recently in Spain, teaching in various conservatories, and conservators although knowing that there is a specialist of Soler's music, a scholar of Soler's music, coming to give masterclass. Most of the students were performing Scarlatti and other composers. So the Scarlatti was the closest that I would get, to Soler. This is sad, an Armenian musician is performing and advocating, for this beautiful Catalan, composer, and that has so much to offer. And I would really, really like to see more musicians and more pianists and harpsichordists, to play this.
Yeah, definitely the music of Antoni Soler should be better known, of course. But I think that you will agree that the sonatas for keyboard, whether harpsichord or clavichord or fortepiano, is actually in his output is the things that are known the most, because quite a few pianists play them. You wrote a dissertation in the United States about this, but how many dissertations are about Soler in the United States? Probably 6, 7, 8, something like that.
You were very, very close. So back in 2008-9, when I was about to defend the dissertation, and that, in those years, I know that there were only 5 dissertations, and 3 out of them were, an analysis of his llave de la modulation. So that doesn't really count. And the other 2 were, yes, discussing his music. But again, it's only 5. And I remember that about 5-6 years ago, a lady approached me from Asia. I cannot remember where exactly from. I think it was from, she was from Taiwan, and she was also working on a dissertation on Soler, and she approached me and asked for my permission to use some of, the materials, and also asked for a quote. So I want to say maybe 6, or hopefully now more. But yes, unfortunately not that many.
Yeah, but there is, even 6 or 7, that would be a fairly okay number, I guess. And also then we have pianists like Alicia La Rocha, who played his music on the piano all over the world, and a lot of people got to know Antoni Soler through the recordings of Alicia, because Alicia La Rocha recorded for Sony and EMI and big labels. So her recordings were widely disseminated. Alicia, of course, she was a Catalan, like Soler too. Just to recap a little bit, a couple of things about his bio. Soler was born in Olot, the town in Girona, and then at a very early age, he studied in the monastery of Montserrat. So basically the heartland of Catalonia. But following his religious vocation and also his musical vocation, he applied for a couple of jobs. He worked at a couple of cathedrals. One of the cathedrals, apparently, for what I've read, musicologists are not 100% sure, but he worked at the Seu d'Urgell, and also in Lleida, the Cathedral of Lleida, supposedly. But soon enough, he moved to San Lorenzo del Escorial in Madrid, and that's where he developed his career, in Madrid. And in Madrid, he developed his career working for the Bourbon monarchy in a very delicate moment in Spanish history, the so-called War of Succession. There are two branches of the monarchs who claim the throne, and Philip V, who was French, as we all know, and he's the Bourbon, wins, these battles, and he starts applying French, quote unquote, modernizing ideas in the kingdoms of Spain. And some of this modernization implies the suppression of certain rights of Aragon and Catalonia and a few other regions. So essentially what I'm saying is that Antoni Soler was working for monarchs who really did not, they really, I'm sorry?
Yeah, who did not support
Did not support his own identity. But of course, what do we know about identities? He moved to Madrid, to the monastery at a very young age. And, we can even say that he is one of the creators, one of the pillars of the Spanish idiom. He was in touch in Madrid. We don't know if he took lessons with Domenico Scarlatti, great master of the harpsichord, and the Scarlatti had already given to his employees, the Spanish monarchs, some of what they wanted, which was a Spanish sound, imitation of castanets on the keyboard, imitation of the guitar, the use of the fandango, and Soler kind of adapts that. Would you agree? And I'm sorry for going on and on with this.
No, I agree with you. Yeah. I absolutely. This is very, very interesting, as you say. The historical surrounding, and this really affects Soler's music and also the popularity of Soler's music. And in a way, maybe I was thinking about it, in fact, last night. Maybe this really affects up until now the popularity, or the lack of the popularity of Soler. Why he's still not as well known as Scarlatti. A lot of the musicians, if they know Soler, they are, oh, he's the Spanish Scarlatti, and this is, in a way, it's killing. What do you mean Spanish Scarlatti? Scarlatti was there to imitate the Spanish sound, and there was Soler, who was doing this organically, because he was Spanish, he was Catalan, and he was from the region. He was the organic, the It's also very interesting, how Philip V, with his Italian wife, came to Spanish court, brought the French court dances, the Italian opera, all those
Farinelli,
fashion. And what's that?
Farinelli.
Well, Farinelli actually came not with Philip V, but Philip V and his Italian wife, they brought all those fashions, of course, and people liked it at first, and then they started rebelling against this suppression of the national costume even and national identity. And by the time of Philip V's death, they were really up in arms with their national identity and wanting to have to have that support. And so Philip's son, Fernando VI, who was born in Spain, was absolutely welcomed by the people as finally, and also Philip the Sixth. Fernando VI. He supported the national identity and he supported the folk art, but brought his princess from Portugal, right, Maria Barbara de Braganza, and people welcomed that as well. They were like, okay, well, this is from the neighboring Portugal, much closer cultural ties. This is going to be different. This is going to be more supportive of our culture. But the funny thing is that Maria Barbara Braganza was a huge fan of Italian musicians and Italian art. And so, yes, she was Portuguese, but she brought all of those Italian musicians, including Farinelli and Galuppi and Scarlatti. So Scarlatti moved to Portugal 10 years prior to Maria Barbara's moving to Spain, and was teaching Maria Barbara there in Lisbon for 10 years. And so she brought him also to Spain. And so this is very, very funny to me that, after an Italian queen in Spain, they were getting finally excited about a closer ties, Portuguese queen that becomes, Spanish queen. And she brings all these Italians with her. And so, yes, she brings all the Italians, but they're supposed to be supportive of Spanish and the local culture. So she asks them, these composers, to imitate the Spanish idioms, right? The Spanish guitar, the castañez, the zapateado, and all of this. Then there is also Soler, the local, who is, Catalan or, working in Spain in Spanish. He is the original, so to say. And so Fernando's brother, right? Because Fernando didn't stay on the throne that long. He died, I think, in about like 10 years or so. Carlos III, and that's whose sons Soler was teaching, and his and the closest student and supporter, almost pretty much a friend or an impresario, was Don Gabriel de Bourbon, so the son of Carlos.
We're basically out of time, and this is, I think that you could talk, and me too, a little bit, but you, of course, you could talk about Soler, for hours and hours. And thank you so much for your erudition, your scholarship. Congratulations on your book. And yes, El Mundo de Antonio Soler, published in Barcelona by Editorial Boileau. So congratulations for your activities, and thank you very much for having this conversation with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you not only for hosting me, but also thank you to Boileau Editorial for publishing my book, for being so supportive and supportive of my work. And I will look forward, to the performances and presenting this beautiful composer around the world as much as possible.
And of course, on YouTube, and also other recordings and live concerts, people can listen to your Soler anytime. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Thank you. In fact, there is a website for this project called www.solersworld.com. and so people can hear also recordings and get the book.
Solerworld.com. Solerworld.
Solersworld.com. One word. Yeah, one word. So solersworld.com. And they can purchase the book. They can read more about the book, the topics that I discussed during the lectures and the presentation, and also have listen to my recordings on this.
Excellent.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
My name is Samantha Schnee, and I'm here in Berlin today with author Irati Elorrieta, the author of Luces de Invierno, this beautiful book with a beautiful cover. And I have been working here at the American Academy in Berlin, translating the novel this semester. And we'd like to share a little bit of the book with you today. Irati, I'm going to tell you her bio now, was born in a coastal village in the Basque Country in 1979. She's a writer in the Basque language and lives in Berlin. She published her short stories Burbujas with Alberdania in 2011, 2 years after the Basque original Burbuilak, which was also published by Alberdania. She has translated works by Rotraut Susanna Berner and Daniel Glattauer from German into Basque, and has collaborated as a columnist in the print media. This novel, Neguko Argiak, which was published by Pamiela, was the winner of the Euskadi Prize for Literature in 2019, and it was published in 2021 in the Spanish language by Galaxia Gutenberg as Luces de Invierno. This one. So welcome, Irati. Would you share a little bit of the Basque novel with us, please?
Hello, Samantha. Yes, I will read a little bit in Basque, so you can hear the sound of it. It's the beginning of a chapter, the number 8. Bigarren zirrikitua, agurra. Atxabiribil ondartza izten duen aitzaren tolesturetan gora egiten du olatuen aparrak. Labarraren gainean, sopelmar urbanizazioa. Ikote izan litezkeen bi paseatzaile ondartzaren handitasunean. Elkarrengandik hurbildoaz, elkarrukitu gabe. Bi silueta bereizi. Bata ainez oinutxik, bestea bere bikotekidea estena oinetakoekin. Inoiz ez zait gustatu jantzita egonik ondartzan zapatak kentzea. Berbetan doazela dirudi, baina ainezen buruan haizeak eta itsasorroek estaltzen dituzte beren hitzak, eta nik ere enuke jakingo esaten zertaz hitz egin genuen paseo luze hartan. Badakit, inoiz elkarukitu ez bagenu bezala ibili ginela elkarren ondoan. Elkarrez ikutzeko kontu handiz, baita elkarukitzeko beldurrez ere, eta elkarrukitzeko desioz. Bai bata eta bai bestea bere siluetaren barruan zurrun, ainezen memoriako irudiak erakusten duen bezala. Eta gogora ekartzea merezi ez dutelako, biok ahaztu ditugun hitzak airean utxalduta.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And it's so interesting to me to try to follow along with the Spanish when you're reading in Basque. And I wanted to ask you why you decided to write the novel in Basque instead of in Spanish.
Well, I think it's not really a conscious decision. It's just a very natural thing for me, because that's my first language, and that's the language in which I always have written. So there is no question about which language I would use to write the novel.
And so how did you come to the decision, after it had been written and published in Basque, to translate it into Spanish?
The novel got a prize in Basque literature, and it was part of the prize to like if it was being translated, I would get the money for the translation. So I had to decide to which language I wanted to translate it. I was thinking about German because I live in Berlin for 20 years now. But I did the easier thing because I had more contact with, or easier contact possibilities with Spanish publishers. So I decided to translate it to Spanish. Yeah.
And how long did that take?
I didn't do it alone, as you already said. I did it with another Basque writer. He's Jon Gerediaga. He is a poet and writes in Basque. He translates his own poems to Spanish. And I asked him if he would like to translate the novel. So he did the first draft of the translation, and then we worked together on this version. I think it took us like, I don't know, maybe 4 months or something.
That's really fast.
Yes, he worked really fast, and he was sending me every day some parts, and then we could work on it. Yeah, it worked very fast. It was also the beginning of the pandemic, so we were both a lot of time at home, and yeah, we could do it fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of authors, I think, feel like translating is a burden, or they've tried it themselves and they don't enjoy it. Did you enjoy the process? Were there things you liked, things you didn't like? Would you do it again?
Yes, I would do it again. I translated my first novel on my own, so I knew that I was comfortable with that. Some Basque writers don't like to translate their books themselves, but I already had done it, and I think it's like writing another version of it.
Yeah.
In a language that I'm comfortable in, so why not do it myself? Yes. And it was good to do it with someone else. Yeah.
And were you tempted to change things when you brought it from Basque into Spanish?
I think I decided before we started that I wasn't going to change things, and yeah.
Yeah, that's good. It makes the process a lot more straightforward.
So I didn't want to rewrite the book. I wanted to make it.
Yeah. Well, would you read us a little bit of the Spanish translation that you and John did, please?
Yeah. So the main character of the book is Agnès, and she's working with a friend, from Vietnam. They are in Berlin and they are working together. That's where I start. En el tramo hasta las vías de tren terminan las casas y empiezan las huertas. El hedor de las ciruelas podridas que han caído al suelo se le une al del carbón que viene de las chabolas. En el paso subterráneo bajo las vías del tren, los plásticos se estremezclan con la hojarasca. Hay restos de muebles mojados, un televisor. Al otro lado se sumergen en un túnel de hojas naranjas. A pocos centímetros de sus cabezas se juntan las ramas de uno y otro lado. Joan también coge con una mano el brazo de Agnès y sujeta la bicicleta con la otra. Estos cerezos se los regaló Japón a Berlín, para que los plantaran en lo que fue la franja de la muerte, le dice. Van cogidos del brazo, en silencio. Un tranvía atraviesa Bösebrücke, una tienda de campaña bajo el puente, entre basura. Agnès acompaña a Swan hasta la pasarela peatonal y al llegar a la mitad le dice que ella se quedará allí. El sol está a punto de desaparecer detrás de la colina negra de Humboldtheim. Bajo la colina hay restos de guerra y 2 búnkers, el más grande de ellos en invierno lleno de murciélagos. Agnès sigue a Swan con la mirada, hasta que éste desaparece puente abajo en bicicleta. Luego se gira hacia las líneas de las vías de tren y el estruendo de los trenes le recuerda a los bramidos del mar. La espuma de las olas asciende por los pliegues de la roca que cerca la playa de Achaviriville. Sobre el acantilado, la urbanización sobre el mar. En la inmensidad de la playa, 2 paseantes que podrían ser una pareja. Van cerca el uno del otro, sin tocarse. 2 siluetas aisladas. Una, Agnès, descalza. La otra, la que no es su pareja, con zapatos. Nunca me ha gustado quitarme los zapatos en la playa cuando estoy vestido. Parece que van hablando, pero en la mente de Agnès, el viento y los bramidos del mar tapan sus palabras, y tampoco yo sabría decir de qué hablamos en aquel largo paseo. Sé que caminamos uno al lado del otro como si nunca nos hubiésemos tocado, con mucho cuidado de no tocarnos, incluso con miedo de tocarnos, y con deseo de tocarnos. Tanto uno como otro, rígido dentro de su silueta, tal y como muestra la imagen en la memoria de Agnès. Y las palabras que ambos hemos olvidado se desvanecen en el aire, porque no merecen ser recordadas. Mientras paseábamos, Agnès ahogó con su verborrea la noche que habíamos pasado juntos. Me había dicho por teléfono que teníamos que hablar y fuimos a la playa de Sopelana en mi coche. Yo quería agarrarla del hombro, alzarla y zarandearla, besarla para que se callara. Agnès diría, pero no lo hiciste. Y avanzamos por la orilla, una descalza, el otro con los zapatos puestos. Ambos dando la impresión de ligereza, los dos tragándonos lo que realmente hubiéramos querido decir. Una cosa es la apariencia y otra es la realidad. Agnès ha caminado hace poco por esa orilla, cuando el sol estaba a punto de ponerse, y se ha cruzado con Laia Spitarte. Las olas voltean con fuerza en las piedras de la orilla, y los golpes entre las piedras se funden con el tren que viene por debajo del puente. Puedo percibir las piedras y los trenes trabados en la garganta de Agnès. La mirada se eleva lo más lejos posible, por detrás del puente, más allá de la estación de tren y de la colina. Ve la playa de Achaviriville desde un alto, desde el borde del aparcamiento. El viento peina la hierba sobre el acantilado. Le revuelve el pelo delante de los ojos que están clavados en la espuma rota del mar. Los ojos negros que cuando era niña buscaban agujeros de grillo. Aquel verano tuvo el pelo largo, lo más largo que yo recuerde, una melena de color castaño oscuro hasta los hombros. El viento podría ensordecer a cualquiera, pero mi voz consigue atravesar el parapeto de Agnès. En París no tienes esto. Gira la cabeza y estoy justo allí, a su lado, sospechando que no me ve realmente. Pero ella no se entera, y al fin y al cabo no quiere verme. No quiere oír lo que ya sabe. Responde, no seas malo, Esteban, y vuelve la mirada al mar embravecido en busca de refugio. El viento nos rodea, lo llena todo, erosiona nuestras palabras sin esfuerzo, como si no las hubiéramos dicho, como si antes de pronunciarlas no hubiera habido voluntad de nada. Pero ahora la resaca las recupera. Y como lo que dije en Sopelana sigue en pie, le susurro, en Berlín tampoco tienes mar. La misma manera de girar la cabeza hacia mí. Esta vez puedo decir con absoluta certeza que no puede verme, aunque daría sus 2 ojos por poder hacerlo.
It's so powerful. Thank you. So, I asked you some questions about what it was like for you to translate the novel. Do you have any questions for me about what it was like to translate from your Spanish into the English before I share the English version of what you just read?
Yes, I do. I'm very curious about how it is to translate a book that is not your book. And I wonder, what is it that you have to connect to in order to be able to get in the process of translating it? What is it that you need to find in the text?
Yeah. So I think it's probably different for all different kinds of translators, but for me, I really have to hear the voice of the narrator in my head. And when I'm reading in Spanish, if I can hear the voice in my head in English, that's a good sign that, it's something that I would be capable of rendering in the English language. And then, if that's true, if I can hear the voice inside my head, then the next step for me is to take a step back and look at the work kind of as a whole and think, what's the content of the book? And is this something that I'm interested in translating? Because you have to spend a lot of time with an author's words when you're translating, as you know. So, there are certainly things that are more interesting to me than others as topics. And I think the thing that really grabbed me, well, two things really grabbed me about Luces de Invierno. One is because I had spent time in Berlin as a young person when I was in university and really fell in love with Berlin, the energy and the diversity and the kind of artistic, it's got this, it's like a crucible. It's got this kind of artistic generative feeling that I think a lot of cities don't have, or if they do have it, it's not so easy to find. And that seems to really kind of pervade Berlin. It's very much a part of the fabric of the city. But then the other thing, which for me was equally important, was the journey that Agnès is on. So it's an internal journey of her own, reckoning with her regrets about the way she's behaved in the past towards Esteban, who appears in the passage that you just read. And the fact that they both have regrets, but how does that, I think all human beings, everybody makes mistakes, everybody has regrets, and how we deal with those regrets can be very different. And some people face them and some people run away from them. So that's the struggle that's going on in this book. And that was what was in English, we would say the clincher for me, that, the idea of writing about that was very appealing. So do you have other questions about the translation before I read a little excerpt? I'm going to read the same part that you read. And if you don't have questions now, you can ask me at the end.
Yeah, and let's listen to the passage, and then maybe we can talk more about it.
Okay, sounds good. So as Irati mentioned, first I'll read from chapter 7, which features the protagonist Agnès walking through the neighborhood with Swan, who is an immigrant from Vietnam, who is one of her new friends, and they've developed quite a close relationship. So this part is from chapter 7. After eating, Swan and Agnès walk to a bar called Kugelbahn. The sun spills its last light onto the chestnut trees, enveloping them, turning the kids who are playing basketball and the man sitting on a nearby bench into dark silhouettes. The man has 2 shapeless plastic bags at his feet. Agnes recognizes him instantly. She whispers to Swan that she often crosses paths with him and that when he's not half asleep, like he is now, he tries to make eye contact with her. You're not afraid of a poor soul like him, are you? He looks like a frightened rabbit to me. As they move down the street, poplars replace the chestnuts. Empty bottles of beer the wind has yet to knock over stand on the ping pong tables. Swan puts them in the basket of his bicycle. Agnes, did you eventually get sick of your job in Paris? No, I liked the films we represented. So why'd you quit? They didn't sell? Girl, I have to pull everything out of you with a corkscrew. I lived with one of the owners, and when we broke up, I had to leave my job, too. Kugelbahn had been closed for 2 years when Laszlo, Swan's downstairs neighbor, discovered it in this no man's land of shadows and noisy trains. Swan points to the box-shaped building between the last 2 buildings on the street. It's half hidden by vines. It doesn't look like this relic from the 50s has changed at all, except for the sign. Its glass facade reveals a renovated bar within. Laszlo removed the plastic tables and slot machines and demolished the interior walls. Everyone told him he was crazy. But it's busy most nights, and recently he's started to serve breakfast on the weekends. That's why Swan has brought her here. While they were eating lunch, he explained that you have to infuse a place with your presence to make it your own, spreading out like a virus. If she's going to live here in Berlin, he said, she should find a job and interact with people instead of living off unemployment and doing the occasional translation. They go upstairs to the balcony in front of the building and press their noses against the glass. On the left, there's a small bar. On the right, there's an exposed brick wall displaying photographs with a fireplace and a pile of wood on the floor. In the back, there's another glass wall that opens onto a patio. A stairway leads to the basement, an old bowling alley. Swan uses the word Kegelbahn, which confuses Agnes. Did you say Kugelbahn or Kegelbahn? The bar is called Kugelbahn, and the bowling alley is a Kegelbahn. Kugel means ball, Kegel means pin. The gardening allotments begin here and run all the way to the train tracks. The smell of coal from the sheds mixes with the smell of rotting plums that have fallen to the ground. In the passageway that runs beneath the tracks, fallen leaves mix with plastic garbage, bits and pieces of damp furniture, a TV. When they come out to the other side, they're in a tunnel of orange leaves. The branches from both sides meet just a few centimeters above their heads. Swan takes Agnes's arm in one hand while steering his bike with the other. Japan gave these cherry trees to Berlin to plant them in no man's land, he tells her. They walk along arm in arm, silent. A tram crosses Busebrücke. There's a tent among the trash beneath the bridge. Agnes accompanies Swan to the pedestrian bridge and tells him that she's turning around when they're about halfway across. The sun's about to disappear behind the black hill of Humboldtine. Beneath the hill lies rubble from the war and the remains of 2 bunkers. The larger of the 2 fills with bats in winter. Agnes watches Swan until he and his bike disappear down the ramp. She turns toward the train tracks. The noise of the trains reminds her of the roaring of the sea. And now I'm going to read from chapter 8, which is narrated by Esteban, who's a friend of Agnes, who either fell or jumped from a cliff off the coast where they grew up and died. And she's being haunted by his ghost, or you could say that perhaps his ghost is a manifestation of her regrets. Sea foam ascends the crevices in the rocks along Achabiribil Beach. Atop the cliff, the Sopelmar housing development. 2 people, possibly a couple, walk on the immense beach. They're close but don't touch. 2 isolated silhouettes. One, Agnes, barefoot. The other, not her boyfriend, wearing shoes. I have never liked taking my shoes off on the beach when I'm fully dressed. It looks like they're talking, but in Agnes's mind, the wind and the roaring sea have swallowed their words. I can no longer recall what we discussed on that long walk either. I know that we walked beside each other as though we had never touched, careful not to touch each other, even frightened of touching, but wanting to touch. Each of us as much as the other, such stiff silhouettes, or so it seems in Agnes's memory. The words we have both forgotten evaporated into the air because they're not worth remembering. As we walked, Agnes drowned the night we spent together in words. She had called me and said we needed to talk, so we drove to the Sopelana beach in my car. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders, lift her up and shake her, to kiss her, to get her to stop talking. Agnes would say, "But you didn't, did you?" So we walked along the shore, one of us barefoot, the other in shoes, both acting cool, both suppressing what we really wanted to say. Appearances are one thing, reality is another. Agnes recently walked along this same stretch of shore at sunset, and she ran into Laia Azpitarte. The powerful waves turn the stones on the beach, and their crashing sound blends with that of the train passing beneath the bridge. It seems to me the stones and the trains are caught in Agnes's throat. Her gaze is lost in the distance, and across the bridge, past the train station, over the hill. She sees the Achabiribo beach from above at the edge of the parking lot. The wind combs the grass on the cliffs and blows her hair into her eyes which are staring at the fragments of sea foam. Those black eyes that, when she was young, searched for crickets. Her hair was long that summer, the longest I can remember it being, a mane of dark chestnut hair falling to her shoulders. The wind would deafen anyone, but my voice succeeds in breaking through to Agnes. You don't have this in Paris. She turns her head and I'm right there beside her, thinking that she doesn't really see me. She doesn't notice. After all, she doesn't want to see me. She doesn't want to hear what she already knows. She replies, "Don't be mean, Esteban," and looks back at the angry sea and escape. The wind surrounds us, filling everything, eroding our words effortlessly, as if we had never spoken them, as if we had no desire for anything at all. But now the undertow is bringing them back. And since what I said in Sopelana is still true, I whisper, you don't have the sea in Berlin either. She turns her head toward me exactly the same way. This time I can say in all certainty that she cannot see me, though she give both her eyes to be able to. So that's a little taste of the novel and the two perspectives that the novel's written from. So as I was reading, did you have any questions come up in your head, Irati?
I was thinking that it's really nice to listen to it in English.
Oh, I'm so glad you like it.
Sounds so nice.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, it's still not completely finished. Like you can see here on my page, I've got like little edits and things that I want to tinker with still, but it's getting there. And I'm really excited for the manuscript to be finished in May and send it out to publishers in English and in German.
Yeah, it's amazing how it sounds like it's the same, but in another. It sounds really good to me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm glad because it sounds really great in Spanish. So it deserves to sound equally wonderful in English. So I don't know how long we've been going, but I think we might be coming up on the end of our time. I think we might only have like 2 minutes left. So is there anything else that you want to add before we go?
I don't know. When you said what you felt when you came to Berlin, I think we have also this in common. I think we have some things in common, like at a personal level, like what experiences we have made. And because for me, it was also like that when I came to Berlin, I fell in love with the city and the energy of the city. And I had this sense of freedom everywhere. And maybe these experiences that we both had with the city is also like a common ground that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's definitely the parts of the novel that are set in Berlin really resonate with me. And I think for me, as I'm translating, I feel almost as though Berlin is a character in the novel, that it's playing a really important role. So in that sense, like it's an homage to Berlin. And I also think, you know, when I was 16, I did an exchange program for high school students. I ended up going to the Basque Country for a summer. And I think that having that experience, although it's not the same town where you grew up and where part of the novel set outside of Bilbao, but having spent time in the País Vasco and getting to understand the culture a little bit, I think also was really helpful to me when I was translating those sections of the novel as well. So I'm really glad that we've been able to work together, and hopefully this will be the first of many collaborations. I can't wait to hear what you're working on now, but we'll save that for another presentation on another day.
Okay.
All right, well, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, Irati, and thank you to SANT JORDI and Marianne Newman for inviting us to participate this year.
Hello, SANT JORDI, USA Translators Community. I'm Claire Longton North, poet, writer, and fledgling translator, and I'm presenting my translation of The Water Horse by Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill. And I'm here today with Maria Elena Carr, novelist and translator of Felicia Fuste, the Catalan poet. And Maria Elena also has a video posted for SANT JORDI on Felicia Fuste, which she has done in collaboration with the poet and translator Mireia Vidal Conte, and you shouldn't miss it. You'll really enjoy it. I've had the privilege and the gift of Maria Elena's writing and translating partnership with my translation of The Water Horse. And this translation was done in Sarah Arvio's Wide World of Translation workshop through Hudson Valley Writers Center. And also, here is my friend of many years, decades actually, Seamus Lynch, and he's zooming in from Ireland, and he will be reading the Gaeilge, or the Irish of the poem that is being brought to you today in English. Now, Nuala Ní Dhomhnach, who is the poet, she writes specifically in the Irish language because she has said she doesn't hear the poetry in English. So Seamus is going to read The Water Horse first in Gaeilge, and we're going to go stanza by stanza, and I'll follow with my translation in English, and then we're going to engage in some conversation with this extraordinary poem, which is filled with myth and mystery and metaphor. Seamus, thanks so much for being here, and I know it's late at night in Ireland, but it would have just been so incomplete without hearing the Irish. So please read the first stanza for us.
So the title, Antioch Ishka by Nuala Ní Dhomhnach. Dúis ba ina chuid tairí amháin a thugad sí chun luí lé. An san lá go raibh inanam is a bheith ag éireacht ba I gúisín na Gaeilge. Bhí sí ag léamh The Old Curiosity Shop le Charles Dickens. Is gan éon cuiinmh a cé ar bha ná le héad. Cada chonaic sí ach na muca mara na scuaine na mo sa gúin. De ghead a crí is anna ceapsí gur a bhíad na bheithí go léir a cí féin a bhí tar éis titim le hail go hoban isteach sa trú. Ceapsí go bhaig sí leathmharú sa bhaile dá bhar. Is de léim sús le teann líon ri agus uain. Sarar hiic sí cad a bhí suas. B'in é an chéad uair a thaig sí chuaigh ar an láthair.
It was only in her dreams at first he came to lie with her. One day she was minding the cows at Sheep's Cove. She was reading The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens, and the cows weren't equal to the plot, when she saw a herd of porpoises out in the harbour. Her heart leapt in fright. She was sure they were her cows fallen from the cliff, all of them at once into the tide. Sure she'd be in for a beating at home. She leapt up in a panic before she saw what they really were. It was the first time he appeared to her there.
In a dhéag sin, tháinig sé a ríis is a ríis chuaigh. Dúis beat lé an taobhdach aisteach a bhíar. An luarach na lordnáin knábhéis is an coppert. Na lábhaní fada déanta do crackan bradán is godán. Ní raibh aon ire eile dar lé, déadfá a rá. Ach charactar néamh-gaine éigean ob scanán an creator ón Lagoon Goran nó fiú King Kong. Ach nuair a bhain sé dó an tlogad a bhí ar a ceann, is crá a bhuain bra ruainní a nús ar a bhuailinn, chonig sí go sa léir an sin gur raibh air óg a bhí ann.
After that, he came to her again and again. At first his fine clothing seemed so odd to her. The breastplate, the fishbone greaves, the helmet, the long gauntlets made from the skin of eels and salmon. She was reminded of the subhuman characters from B-movies, the creature from the Blue Lagoon, or a refined King Kong. But when he took off his helmet and shook his beautiful mane loose onto his shoulders, she saw clearly he was a fine young man.
An son tháinig lá gur cuir sé a cheann ina thucht. Bhí na mílta móra ag búrthil híos búthú faoi loch. Is na muca mara ina dáinte léigheala mór himpeall.
At last the day came when he put his head on her breast. The sea creatures were bellowing on the water below them, and the gleaming porpoises flocked around them.
Sa tránó na hír do chonig daoine a bhí ar an gnách le bae ad. is I deanga éigen íosachta a hic sí, cén ar bhéidir lé in na focail a dhéanamh amach I gceart. Dír sé uirthi a cheann a glanna, is na míle a bhí ag cro an chin a cnaga le na hinge fada.
Later on in the gloaming, they were seen by people out after cows on the mountain. In a foreign tongue, she understood, although she couldn't grasp all the words. He asked her to comb his hair and use her long nails to crush the vermin tormenting his head.
Dhéon sí amhlaidh. Bhí sí ag puirtear go bog faoin na hanáil, is a bhréige nuair a bhuine aistí an phrab, is giat a crí uirthi. Bhí dúlamáin is dúlas gur cloch ag fás I measc rútaí na grúige aige. Thig sé lárach cad a bhí suas, is nár maith an ara é. An son, nuair a bhrá sí barína luas aige, thig sí leis nach ar labhraí lorca amháin sa scéal a bhí na luas a capall.
So she did what he asked. She hummed softly under her breath, soothing him, when suddenly fear stopped her heart. A jumble of sea wrack and rock moss were growing in the roots of his hair. She knew at once what that meant and how terrible it was. Then she felt the tips of his ears, and she knew it wasn't only Lavre Loric in the old story who had horse's ears.
Gur bhrúch brat fuairlis trína crackan amach, do bhain sí míotóg amháin nó go nó trí, as a crómán is ní dúirt sí faic. Lean sí uirthi ar feadh an ama ag cír a chin, ag crónán is a pórtareacht, ag gháilt de huaintrithe is de giotí beaga árán, a bhréige is a meabhla de hír consúin. An son, nuair a bhrá sí fad os níle ag teacht ina tína an áil, de scuil sí snad meana a haprún, go cuaireamach is go mar, is thug sí is thug dus na banabé é. Rishi ins na tréanta tríd an bhail go tig a míntere.
She broke out in a cold sweat, it running down her skin, and she pinched her thigh, once, twice, 3 times. Still she kept on combing his hair, crooning and murmuring lullabies and snatches of songs to beguile and lull him into sleep. And as soon as she heard his breathing become the size of sleep, she untied her apron strings, quick and nimble, and ran hard and fast up the cliffs to the house of her people. At first, all that came out.
No, I'm next. That's as far as I went.
Are you sure? I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Dúis is léad gibberische a bháin I Dave Ruti family is close a couple a dasker as a veil. Dere nuair a hiige le dasgaracht nuair a hiige le deacaracht agus faoi gioid de lucht an tí cad a bhí árá aché. Dahaníidir lárach is ar an buinte buise gur a bheith an taobh isce é. Dairiador is bát suas orthú a gcuid balca sí. A bharas arm is a néad a catha. Is ritheadar amach ina muon armtha ar tí a bharatha. At first.
Okay, at first all that came out of her mouth was a stream of gibberish about seaweed roots and horses' ears. At last, when her people struggled to understand what she was saying, they knew then and there it was the water horse. They got up, put on their clothes and armor, and went out as an armed patrol to pursue and murder him.
Bhí seanslí a dúirt na héine ina dhiag son, bhí agus gur dóbar de, éon bar his le bháin, éon gníomh bit catí, is bhí si ite aige, scan, bhío bahúk, cnába agus ile, trí lá ina dhiag na tubiste seans go mbeadh a hé an dás go bhóig a cé is na dúháin le peochas sús bhara tíde. Bíonn an sort an bhí é. Bhíor dóibh do hiic sí san. Mar sin féin, do lig imeachtaí an lé úd go trám hí. Do hiic sí síos air na fáile lá iníag lé eile.
She was lucky, her people said afterwards. She was, and it was a near thing. One trip, one stumble, and he'd have eaten her alive, blood, bones, and all. 3 days after the tragedy, they'd chance on finding her liver, lungs, and kidneys tossed up at high tide. He was that kind of a beast. She knew it was true for them, but she felt the weight of that day heavy in her. She sat there on the edge of the cliff, day after day.
Is he a queen of Lonar Uhine, na súl bír sceabhach aige, a déag irthaí le fáin, is a bhí chós. Simply san is cóglán, bhláin ina hlíhéin le hampla ocrais. Trí le ridmach na géag down, is conas a chuilíodar in a ríistí cúnga ag rí na lábha aige. Thar aon ní eile de cuimhnigh si bhatáin ílathe a chuirt a bhí có haclí is có teann le bóa ina I bharas. An teannas a bhí ann mar a bheith sprunga tó Christa, a bheith ar tine ligóní is réig faoi bráid a ascuilta.
She remembered the green light in his slanted eyes, looking at her with desire. 'Twas so pure, bright, and clear, in its own way, a healthy hunger. The rhythmic gleam of his brown arms narrowing to slim wrists, the shape of his hands. But above all, she remembered his muscles weaving through his body, tense and light as a taut bow. The spring tightly wound, alive beneath his chest, always ready to be free. Seamus, thank you so much. I mean, I could not have imagined that the three of us would be here together doing this, and that I would have someone speaking the Irish and bringing that life to it. So my first question to you, both or one of you, whichever, is how did you feel when you first read The Water Horse?
Seamus, do you want to go first?
No, you go first.
Okay.
It's like,
Well,
I can't figure out what to say.
well, the first time I read it, okay, the first time I really paid attention to it was in your translation, Claire. I think I may have read it in another translation, and because of where, excuse me, where I was, and because of maybe some of the translation choices, which I'm sure are perfectly valid, mostly because of myself as a reader, it didn't really register with me. It was mythology, otherworldly creature. But when I read it in your translation, I saw, the first thing I noticed was all the levels, that this is not just about human encountering an other. And, we have those in every culture, Poseidon is a bull seducing the girl on the beach, Leda and the swan. And in the Amazon, we have lightning gods and animals that have their way with cute humans. And so, and both in both genders, right? The examples I gave were male mythical creature or otherworldly creature. And so what I saw was that there was a lot more. And she puts that in our mind with the allusion to the B movies. So one could just read it and think, okay, this is an encounter. But since she says that, she brings it into at least one of the many levels. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I talked way too much.
No, nobody can talk way too much, only on Zoom. we have some of these boundaries. But yes, that's what leapt to me as I went through the poem. And who among us hasn't been other? I have at least one episode every day where I feel like I am other, especially in the world we have, and embroiled as we all can be in reading the news. So yeah. And Nulani Dona, she leads with Irish myth. She also sometimes she'll lead with classical myth sometimes in her poems, but mostly Irish myth. And what I was pulled in by was the layers of metaphor and how myths bestow these on us in every language, and how every age can bring another layer to us. The interpretation deepens, or we find ourselves maybe as metaphor for a different character or event in the myth. So Zoom just told me we have 10 minutes.
Oh, where did that go?
So, please have at it.
Yeah, so for me, I have to say, when I read the poem first, I didn't really hugely connect with it, and I think I read the other. I didn't want to read your translation because I didn't want to get. I wanted that to discover later. I didn't want to. Yeah, I felt I read the other one, right, and but I think for me is that it's the reading it in Irish really is a different ball game entirely, and having learned Irish as a kid and being in Irish school and everything, and so it's like going back in time for me really, and discovering that unique expression that the Irish language is, and the pure expression that it is, it's like in Irish, I always say there's no harsh words in Irish. Everything is melodious and it's expressive, and yeah, there's not much violence in the language. Even the violence isn't that violent. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I kind of rediscovered that, and yeah, and the whole thing of the sea creatures and the kind of half world between imagination and myth, and then I just thought to myself, puberty. I think it's puberty in here somewhere. And that dreamy half, kind of, the kind of teen dreamy kind of half-world that people, hormonal half-world that people live in teens. And, you know, like, you know, the way she was minding the cows and reading something in English, and her mind was neither here nor there, you know, that vagueness of it all, you know. And I think that's really nicely expressed in it, in the language.
Mary Elaine and I were discussing the liminal place, and was that how the water horse possibly made his road into her life and her consciousness?
The what place?
What?
You
The
said,
liminal place, what you just
Liminal.
described. You know, where the veil is kind of thin between
yeah,
the
yeah.
consciousness, between, you know, you're straddling different realities.
Yeah,
In fact,
I'm not fully present in either.
yeah, the old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens.
Yeah.
And when you really look at that, you know, that.
Yeah.
I think
Go ahead, Maria Elena.
I think Seamus's point about the adolescence, which I had not actually considered, but that is huge. And of course, when are we more between one world and another than as teens? I mean, we're children and we're going to be adults, but also we feel everything is so. It's so powerful, right? You know, first love, we think we invented everything. And because it's the first time we're feeling it and our hormones are wreaking havoc, right? And so I think that's really awesome. So I really appreciate that point, Seamus. And also it links directly to that first line in parenthesis, or it's not in parenthesis, but the first two lines, which I had not noticed when I first read this. I was lucky enough to read it some time ago. And I thought, whoa, is this an unreliable narrator? Because it's like, oh, I dreamed of him. At first, it was only in dreams. And then he came. And then I sent my family to kill him.
Yeah, and then was it all a dream? That was the other thing that occurred to me.
Exactly. The reliable, is it, how reliable is this?
Yeah.
And yeah, the kind of cruel language around the beat, like very harsh, cruel language. Yet somewhere inside there's a gentleness too, because he put his head on her breast. But everything else that's reported about him is like vicious, get away from me, devour you, you know. And yeah, it's such a contrast there. You know, I was also struck with the kind of at the end, the whole metaphor of the bow and the you know,
spring
tightness and the spring and whatever. And yeah, I couldn't quite get that. Yeah, I'm still thinking about it. Because I've only been living in this poem for 2 days now.
Well, the bow is very figural in a number of mythologies. And, you know, just as it's not only a weapon or used for hunting, but it's also a sacred object. And there's the kind of bow that's used to strike the spark to make fire. Absolutely. And you know, Seamus, here's a quote from Nuala about Irish. Irish is a language of beauty, historical significance, ancient roots, and an immense propensity for poetic expression through its everyday use. And that to me is, I think, why I'm very impassioned by it in a lot of ways, and that the challenge of translating it is, all right, here we have the language, but also we have how Irish people speak English in a particular way and how to capture that in translation, which I don't think some other languages, particularly maybe Romance languages, have as much of a drive with that.
I would say, so Catalan, the people who speak Catalan almost always also speak Spanish. So both languages coexist, just as Ukrainian and Russian coexist. And people code switch according to the situation. And I think every location, every culture is a little bit different about how it works and what the language, and also for each individual. But I would ask Seamus, and not to put Claire on the spot here, but you pointed out that there is no harsh sound in Irish. There's a lot of harsh sounds in English. Do you feel that Claire's translation does in fact reflect the gentleness or the melodious aspect of the Irish in the English? And that's one question. And the second is, do you feel it also reflects, as she is aiming, the English spoken by Irish people?
Yeah, I kind of held off. I didn't want to read Claire's.
Calling a bit of time. We have 1 minute and 13 seconds left.
Oh, God. Yeah, it's a big question. I held off. I didn't make it. That was the first time I heard Claire's translation. I was holding off from it. I wanted to fresh. So and it's quite different to the other one. And yeah, so I can't answer that straight away because it's too quick, but there's not enough time. But I'm not avoiding. I was getting a sense of it as she spoke it, and now I'm going to read it and see what I really think. So I'm not answering it directly because I haven't made up my mind about it. And that's neither good nor bad. It's nothing, I'm no hidden agendas. Claire should never talk to me again. Oh, it was lovely talking to Mary Elena. Now, me and Longton, I don't know how it's going to go from here after that.
It will go some way. But I want to thank you both for just a beautiful session.
Good morning and welcome to this conversation about Fernando Pessoa's masterpiece, The Book of Disquiet, as part of the celebration of SANT JORDI in New York. It is a great pleasure for me to count with the presence of two individuals who are integral to Fernando Pessoa's editorial history, Margaret Jewel Costa and Jerónimo Pizarro. Margaret Jewel Costa is quite possibly, allow me this caution, the most significant translator of Portuguese literature into English, with a long career, an extensive body of translated works, and innumerable awards. Jerónimo Pizarro is probably, let me exercise caution once more, the foremost specialist in Fernando Pessoa's work worldwide. He has overseen and continues to oversee current editions of Pessoa's work in Portugal, and Pizarro is responsible for the latest edition of The Book of Disquiet, translated precisely by Margaret Jewel Costa and splendidly published by New Directions. Welcome, both of you.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Bernard. Morning. Thank you.
I would like to begin by introducing Fernando Pessoa for those who are not familiar with the writer. The great linguist and literary theorist Roman Jakobson wrote that he considered Pessoa to be one of the great artists of the 20th century, on par with James Joyce, Pablo Picasso, Igor Stravinsky, and Le Corbusier. How would you briefly introduce Fernando Pessoa? Let's start with Margaret's response.
Okay. Well, I think for me, I think it's very important that the fact that Pessoa lost his father when he was 5 years old. His mother remarried, and he went to Durban, to live in Durban in South Africa, I always feel he had a kind of split childhood, really, part in
in Lisbon and then in Durban, where he obviously learned English and French, apparently, and he was a very brilliant young man, as one can imagine. But even as a young man, he started writing heteronyms. He started writing under different names. I mean, I think Jerónimo and Patricio found 136 different heteronyms. I mean, some with a tiny, tiny body of work, but and then when he went back to Lisbon, supposedly to do a degree at the university, he abandoned the degree and he just started as a commercial translator. So working in working in various offices, translating from and into English and French. But then the heteronyms took on more importance, I think, and there were really, I suppose, 4 or 5 important heteronyms: Alberto Caeiro, Álvaro de Campos, Ricardo Reis, and Bernardo Soares, who's the author, entre comillas, of the Book of Disquiet. And he also wrote as Fernando Pessoa ele mesmo. So he made himself a heteronym, which, I mean, it's all very, very weird when you start to think about it, but it's also what's fascinating about him, I think. And I think the other famous thing about Pessoa was that he died having published very little during his lifetime, but he left as Jerónimo will know personally, he left masses and masses of bits of paper, some typed, some handwritten illegibly, on all kinds of things, backs of envelopes, bits of paper, whatever. And that is what has formed his work, really. That's what people like Jerónimo have pieced together to make, particularly the Book of Disquiet, which he didn't have a shape for that at all. And there were 2 authors of it to start with. So that's really all you need to know about Fernando Pessoa, apart from reading him, of course. Okay?
Well, nice to meet you, Margaret. Let me just add, well, there's this classical article by Roman Jakobson. It's a very important article on Pessoa, an early one. And I was discussing in these last days with Lydia George, like a definition of Pessoa. And we agree that Pessoa today is one of the main voices of modern consciousness. I think that's a way of making like a brief with Jakobson. And Lydia George wrote recently, it's often difficult to choose among the relevant figures of a country, the one who best lends their effigy, their figure to represent a nation. In this case, among Portuguese poets, Fernando Pessoa assumes such importance, and his work transcends the field of literature as it is commonly interpreted, that the indication of his name to represent us, Portugal, as a collective become unavoidable, especially since beyond the people he represents, the radiation of his creative personality has long ceased to know boundaries. I think, to add something to what Lydia George wrote, that Pessoa today is like a representation of Portugal, and Portugal is represented by Pessoa. So sometimes we think of both Pessoa and Portugal almost as being the same, and I think that says a lot of what Pessoa represents today inside and outside of Portugal.
Okay. In his review of the first edition in English, George Steiner attempted to define the book as a fusion of Coleridge's Notebooks on Marginalia, of Valéry's philosophic diary, and of Robert Musil's voluminous journal. How you could define the Book of Disquiet? What can you say about its singularity? Let's start this time with Jerónimo's response.
Well, that's a difficult question in a few minutes. Steiner's comparison is compelling. Personally, I will describe the book like an exploration, a labyrinthic exploration of the human condition, of that modern consciousness I was talking about. I think the singularity of the book lies in its ability to capture the essence of desasosiego, that is Pessoa's word or term for maybe Baudelaire's spleen, for some kind of what in the 19th century was considered spleen, so desassossego is the Portuguese work, and he captures that desassossego with lyricism, with poetry, with a profound introspection, and we have like a glimpse to Pessoa's figure and life through Disquiet. So when I think about the Book of Disquiet, yes, we can think about Musil, Valery, Coleridge, but I think there is also like a French branch, so to speak, because I mentioned Baudelaire. Pessoa is engaged with Amiel's diary, and he has a dialogue with Amiel. And we can also think or remember Mallarmé, who stated that everything in the world exists to culminate in a book. And now, this is not any kind of book. This is a very special kind of book written in theory by a bookkeeper. And it's what in English you will call a ledger, if you know what it means. I mean, a book containing accounts to which debits and credits are posted from books of original entry. So we are in a specific world, not only a literary diary, but let's say the ledger, the book of a bookkeeper, that it's telling us about his commercial life in the Baixa Lisboeta. And just to finish, from an editorial perspective, I always like to quote Eduardo Lourenço, because Lourenço has a very important perspective of the book. The book was published for the first time in 1982, and 1 or 2 years later, Lourenço wrote, the Book of Disquiet is a text that Fernando Pessoa never had materially, physically before his eyes. Thus, and only for that reason, being his book, it is even more ours than his other texts normally are. From an empirical textual cause, the editors made a book, and the editors raised a semantic and hermeneutic disquietude that will never leave us. So Pessoa never had the book that we have today in our hands.
Great. The Book of Disquiet remained unpublished for almost half a century after its author's death. It is the result of editorial decisions involving the selection and combination of fragments that Pessoa kept in various stages of production. It was never completed, never organized into a cohesive whole, and always remained fragmentary. Consequently, there are as many versions of the Book of Disquiet as there are editors, with no 2 versions containing the same number of fragments. This double question is for Jerónimo. As you once said, this is not so much a book as different editorial incarnations. Could you elaborate on the main editorial decision you made and the differences between your edition and others that exist?
Yeah, well, last week or recently it was published a new edition of the Book of Disquiet in Barcelona by the publishing house Alma. So it will be like a nice surprise when you get back from New York to Barcelona with illustrations by a very important illustrator in Lisbon. And then I was writing for the epilogue, trying to explain that of the Book of Disquiet, you have 4 editions, considered the editions of different experts, not counting many others that we can imagine fixated with different levels of subjectivity. And that the New Directions edition, the one that is, there are 2 editions, I have them here. This was published by Serpent's Tail in the UK, and this was published in New York by New Directions. It's the same translation by Margaret Jewel Costa. Is based on the only critical edition that was published in Portugal 14 years ago. And it's the only one following, almost the only one following a more strict essay on chronological basis of the arrangement of all the fragments, because the word book, I mean, the title of this work is The Book, but book, if we go by the UNESCO definition of book, is not the best word. It will be only a printed non-periodical publication consisting of at least 49 pages, not counting the cover pages. So if a book is only 49 pages, we can have many books out of this book. And in fact, in the UK, there was a proposal by, I don't know if you know Margaret, I know that she knows because she was asked to, the Half Pin Press is a wonderful, I don't know if publishing house, but the Half Pin Press a few years ago did not publish the book, they published the box of Disquiet.
I have it here.
And you have it here. And I was able to pay a lot of money, but to order a copy for me, I have one in Bogota now. And it is like 150 fragments in different material supports done to be pick up of the box, read in any order. And I think that sometimes we need, let's say, the Book of Disquiet as a book for a publishing house and for booksellers. But if we were trying to imagine the book as a box or as a trunk, and Pessoa left at least one big, very big trunk and some small trunks as arcas, as baúles. Instead of reading a box, maybe we would like to read, instead of reading a book, maybe we should do a box of Disquiet as the Half Print Press did, I think in 2017, more or less.
Yeah, can
I don't know, now that you have the box there, Margaret.
I have the box, yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, I think the wonderful thing about the Book of Disquiet, one of the many wonderful things, is that it is completely random. And in a way, there are lots of different editions and they're all in a completely different order. And I think Pessoa would have loved that, actually, because he never put it into any order. And I don't think he would have liked it as in any order. And I think with the Half Pint Press, it's, they're all on different, there's, it's on raffle tickets and paper bags.
And a pencil,
a slide and things. It's everything.
Slide.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful thing. And I'm sure Pessoa would have loved that. And I do rather, I love Geronimo's edition, which is very complete, but at the same time, I think it needs to be read in any kind of order.
Yes, exactly.
You need to dip and skip and just see what you feel like reading. And that's the pleasure of it, that you alight on things you hadn't read before, bits you hadn't read before. For me, anyway.
No, I agree. So for me, this Half Print Press edition is one of the most valuable editions I have at home.
Definitely.
Yes.
Regarding the editorial diversity of the work, as Margaret Jules Costa stated, and I'm quoting now, every subsequent Portuguese edition and every translation has inevitably been different. I have two questions now for Margaret. As a translator, you have the singularity of having translated two different editions, as Geronimo said, of the Book of Disquiet, separated by about 25 years. How have the differences between both editions conditioned the translation? And secondly, you have written that in the case of this book, and I quote again, keeping close to the original simply won't work. Paradoxically, the translation has to take quite a bold step away from the original if meaning and imagery are to be preserved. So my second question is, to what extent is this always the case in every translation, and to what extent is it especially so in the case of the Book of Disquiet?
Yeah, can I answer the second question first? In that I don't really agree with myself. I think you should be careful what you write down. No, it's just, I think translation is as a process. You're always coming and going between staying close to the original and moving away. And so it's not just Pessoa, it is in every translation. And it's a very pragmatic process, I think, translation. And so I agree with myself partly on that. But also, as you were asking about, was there a difference? Did it change my translation at all in returning later on to the Book of Disquiet? Not really, no. But I mean, because the first part of the new edition, of the New Directions edition, is written by Vicente Guedes, who's another heteronym who didn't last very long, apparently. So he was a short-lived one. And he is at that tone, the tone of the Vicente Guedes is very different. It's more full of existential angst and so on. Whereas you get that in Bernardo Soares, but for me, the Bernardo Soares as a translator, I really it could inhabit that voice. For me, it was a very kind of, I mean, when I started translating it for 25 years ago or longer, I found it was very, very difficult, and I thought I really shouldn't have said yes to this. I should have admitted I couldn't do it. But then it became very companionable somehow. Because once I got used to that voice and that sensitivity, that sensibility, it was a wonderful experience. And when I return to it and reread it, it's still a wonderful experience.
When, as Fernando Pessoa wrote, there are two ways of being right. The first is silence, the second is contradiction. So.
Yes. Yes, hurrah for contradiction.
Well, finally, to end this conversation, I would like for you to read a passage from the Book of Disquiet that you particularly enjoy for our viewers. Let's start this time with Jerónimo.
Well, I lost the one I was going to read, but that's excellent. So I randomly selected another one. And yeah, because in fact, there is no order for this book. We can pick up and it's good or open the book in any page. And sometimes I think we should do that. There is also one of the readings of the book, one of the interpretations is that maybe everyone is dead, or that sometimes you feel that everyone is dead in the Book of Disquiet. And I open one speaking about death. So I will read only the end of the fragment in the New Directions edition is on page 187. And well, the number of the fragment has no importance, but if by any chance you have this edition, is 206. Did I say my contract with death? No, not even with death. Anyone who lives the way I do does not die. He comes to an end, withers, merely ceases to vegetate. The space he occupied continues to exist without him. The street he walked along remains, though he's no longer seen there. The house where he lived is inhabited by not him. That is all, and we call it nothing. But where we put it on, not even this tragedy of denial will be guaranteed applause, for we do not know for certain that it is nothing. We who are as much the vegetables of truth as we are of light, the dust that covers the window panes both inside and out, the grandchildren of destiny and the stepchildren of God, who married eternal night when she was left by a widow, by cows, or true father. To leave Rua dos Douradores for the impossible, to get up from my desk and set off into the unknown, a journey intersected by reason, what the French call the great book. And just two brief notes. Rua dos Douradores was one of the possible alternative titles for the book. So Pessoa did not change the title, but he thought of changing the title, and the plan B was Rua dos Douradores. So this is very nice. And we have here, and it's correct, a journey intersected by reason, but that reason, it's also the book I was talking about, because in Portuguese reason has that sense of a ledger. So this could be the book where you take notes of the accounts of empresa comercial, or it can be also this reason, this French reason that Pessoa is talking about.
Okay, shall I read my extract? I've got lots of favorites, but this is one very favorite one. It's number 417. And it's just about seeing a light in the night in someone else's window. High up in the lonely night, an unknown lamp blooms behind a window. Everything else in the city is dark, except where feeble rays from the street lamps hesitantly rise and here and there resemble the palest of earthly moonlight. In the black of the night, the different colours and tones of the houses are barely distinguishable. Only vague, one might almost say abstract differences point up the irregularities of the unruly whole. I am connected by an invisible thread to the anonymous owner of the lamp. It is not often we are both awake at the same time, and there is no possible reciprocity in this, for since I am standing at my window in the dark, he cannot see me. It's something else, mine alone, something to do with the feeling of isolation that participates in the night and the silence and chooses that lamp as something to hold on to because there is nothing else. It seems as if it is only because that lamp is lit that the night is so dark. It seems that it is only because I'm awake, dreaming in the blackness, that it is there, a light. Perhaps everything exists only because something else does. Nothing just is. Everything coexists. Perhaps that's right. I feel that it wouldn't exist at this hour, or not at least in the exact same way with my present consciousness of myself, which, because it is consciousness and because it is present, is at this moment entirely me, if that lamp were not lit over there, somewhere, a lighthouse marking nothing, erected on the false prestige lent it by its height. I feel this because I feel nothing. I think this because this is all nothing, 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 just part of the night and the silence and of whatever emptiness, negativity, and inconstancy I share with them, the space that exists between me and me, a thing mislaid by some god. I just think that's so beautiful, that he can take just seeing a light in the dark and he can transform this into a whole existential experience. It's absolutely wonderful, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to me being with you in this conversation. And I want to thank you again, Margaret and Jerónimo, to join us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
At this time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, a happy SANT JORDI celebration in New York. And I will be in Barcelona in September. I hope to meet you.
Yeah, sure. I'll be there.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thank
Goodbye,
you,
Bernard.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.
And
Okay,
very nice
bye.
to see you, Margaret. Bye.
Yes, love to see you, Jerónimo.
Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.
My name is Ilse Duarte. I am a Portuguese to English literary translator, and I'm here to talk with Jessie Lee Kercheval.
I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about your translation of Marilia Onod, especially about her book of short stories, the Book of Effects. Do you want to talk a little bit? I'd like to hear a little bit more about you, a little bio maybe, and a little bio for her too.
I was born and raised in São Paulo, Brazil, and Marilia is from the northeast of the country. Marilia, I've been translating mostly contemporary authors and mostly Marilia's work. Marilia started out as a short story writer, and then she added novels to her range of writing. Let's see, sorry.
Well, I'd love to hear you read. I'd love to talk about the novels a little bit, but first I'd love,
yeah. So
I'd like to hear you read a little bit more.
Okay. I'll be reading from this book that's not out yet, but this is what it's going to look like. It's called The Book of Effects, and it is a short story collection of 9 stories. I am also the very proud recipient of the Sundial House 2024 Literary Translation Award, and that it is part of this award that this book is going to be published later this year. The Book of Effects is, as the title suggests, a book of stories about the intense emotions that drive us, that guide us, and often misguide us. And this book is very interesting to me because of the topic, but also because the narrators are always first-person narrators, so they're pouring out their hearts. But there's also a diversity of narrators. In some stories, the narrator is female. In other stories, the narrator is male. In some stories, the narrator is a child. In some stories, an adult. So you have this range of experiences and perspectives. The story that I'm going to read from is called Sunflowers in Hell. And this is a story about a widow who is in shock because her husband has died very recently, untimely, unexpectedly. And she also finds out that when he died, he was in his car with somebody else. And it had been a sexual encounter. She's obsessed about finding out who this person is. And I'm starting the story from the middle. I will read a few sentences in Portuguese and then in English. Precisava conhecê-la, olhá-la no branco dos olhos, tocá-la, escutá-la, enfim, assegurar-me de sua existência e assim depurar-me daquela ferida funda. Havia deixado um único rastro, Girassóis no Inferno. Assim intitulava-se o conjunto de poemas encontrados por ocasião da morte de Arturo. Podia farejá-la ali, uns 30 escritos à mão, em folhas avulsas de papel, que, na pressa de escapar, esquecera no banco traseiro do carro. I had to meet her, look her in the eye, touch her, hear her. I had to assure myself of her existence, cleanse myself of that deep wound. She had left a single trace behind, Sunflowers in Hell. That was the title of the collection of poems found upon Arturo's death. I could track her scent on those pages, 30 or so, written by hand on loose sheets of paper, which she had left in the back seat in her hurry to get away. She had surely brought them along so my husband could appraise them. It seems there had been no time for that because he hadn't made any notes on the margins the way he used to when he evaluated his students' writing. I took Sunflowers in Hell to an expert I knew. I told him I had found them in Arturo's desk and would like to return them to the author as they seemed to be the originals, but unfortunately there had been no identifying information. Or perhaps they had been copies of somebody else's work, someone mediocre or great, known in the field but unknown to me. I had read those poems dozens of times, but had no idea of their merit. They seemed too somber, hermetic, arrogant. What I had hoped in reality was that they would tell me the history of the love affair. The professor took the poems and promised he would call me as soon as he had finished reading them. A few days later, he came over. He sounded very enthusiastic. I would have been so pleased to hear those were the poems of a minor writer. No, they were tremendously beautiful, wild, anti-academic, and he would love to meet the author of such powerful original poems. I was devastated. I thanked the professor and told him I hadn't lost hope, that although it was unlikely, one day whoever had written those poems would turn up and claim them. He asked if he could keep some of the poems. He knew many people in the field, writers, critics, artists, who knows? He might by chance find himself face to face with the author who had so moved him. Months went by. I told myself time and again I would not go back to the site of the tragedy, but like a sleepwalker or guided by occult forces, there was I, or rather a part of me that was still alive, imprisoned by the same morbid thoughts, interrogating and torturing me, trying to comprehend, to offer me the possibility of forgiveness. No one ever walked by the spot where Arturo had chosen to be alone with his love. Every now and then, an airplane or a flock of egrets would fly across the sky. Some animals grazed in the distance, white and slow, unaware of their own existence, of death and loneliness. As I looked on, I was filled with the desire to be one of them, non-thinking, free of any wounds to the soul. What I had then were those empty afternoons, the flatness of a blue or grayish sky overhead, and the sweet rustling of the wind through the leaves of the fig tree. The quiet gave me the feeling I was disintegrating, becoming shreds of myself, a self without Arturo, sinking in the tangle of roots. I would close my eyes and feel the pulsing of underground waters, the smell of the earth, its deep breathing underneath my body. I felt temporarily pacified, but would soon go back to ruminating over a history that wasn't mine because I had been irrevocably pushed away from it. I could even hear the laughter, the voices, the moaning, feel the heat of the bodies in their embrace, smell the acrid and exciting odor of love. Chills ran through my arms and legs as I dived into that dark river with no edges and no bottom. My pain. So I will leave it there, and our readers will find out if our protagonist narrator discovers who it was that was with her husband, and if she can finally find some peace.
So remind us when the book's coming out and who is publishing it.
So Sundial House is publishing it. I'll show it again. This will be in December 2024. Sundial House is an imprint of Columbia University Press, and you will find information about the book, bios and synopsis on the Columbia University Press site.
That's wonderful. Could you talk a little bit about how you came across her work and what really drew you to her work and how you decided to translate the stories?
Yeah, I discovered her work in 2014. I was in São Paulo browsing books at a brick and mortar bookstore, and I came upon one of her books. It was her novel, her first novel, Suite of Silence. I opened the book to the first page, started reading, and was captivated right away. I bought the book, I started translating it, and I loved the writing. I loved the story, how it flowed. I loved the lyricism of her prose. She writes beautifully. Her characters are complex. They are flawed. You may not even like her characters, but as a reader, I couldn't help but root for them. I wanted them to do better. I wanted them to find the answers to their questions. I was engrossed. I was so engaged with the first story. And then I started finding out more about her. Oh, she had written lots of short stories too. And I started reading her short stories and loved them. And it didn't take long for me to know for sure that I wanted to translate her work. I contacted Marilia via social media and sent her a sample of my translations. She liked it, and our partnership, our collaboration started very early on, probably 2015.
That's wonderful. You know, we actually first met when I accepted a piece of her novel, The Secret Bird, for the Northwest Review, when I was a translation editor there. And it was a great joy. I love that book. And one of the things that struck me was that it's a print magazine, so I could only take like 5 pages of prose, which is hard to do from a piece of prose to make it stand out. But
yeah.
Like any 5 pages of that novel, and they would just jump off the page. Could you talk about that novel a little bit?
The Secret Bird, in my opinion, is her best work so far. It's a very intense story about a woman who's approaching her 40th birthday and looking back at her past experiences, especially her teenage years, which were very, very difficult. She is the daughter of a man who's very famous. He's an actor, he's a playwright, he's been on TV, everybody knows him. And to everybody else, he's very charming, but to the family members, he's very distant. He is emotionally unavailable. Things get much, much worse. They were difficult for her as a 13, 14-year-old, but things get much, much worse when she finds out that she has a half-sister. Her father had an affair with a French actress when he was already married to her mother. So she found out she has this half-sister who is living now in France, but is soon going to come and live with them in Brazil, with the family in Brazil. This girl is everything that she is not. This girl is very easy to get along with. Everybody loves her. And our protagonist also, it's written in first person too. Our protagonist is very withdrawn. She's very smart, but she has difficulty relating to others. And all of this is very hurtful to her. But the worst thing for her is that now she sees her father lavishing attention and affection on this girl that he barely knows. And everybody in the family accepts her so readily. So she is in a tremendous amount of pain. She doesn't know how to express her feelings to anyone. The book is called The Secret Bird because all of this angst that she has to be kept inside. And to her, it is some kind of winged animal that's inside her. And it is the secret bird because she can't communicate her pain to anybody else. So she needs to deal with that pain. She wants to destroy that pain. And in the process, she makes a series of very bad decisions that end up harming her. She almost destroys herself with this series of actions that she takes that, as I said before, as a reader, you're rooting for her. No, don't go there. Don't go there. You're rooting for her to be better, to feel better, to overcome her difficulties and her shortcomings. It's a very intense novel. And what I'm telling you, it's just the storyline. There's so much more to it. there is.
I was so struck by the beautiful language in it, which you can see her language in the short stories as well.
Yes.
And,
go
so
ahead.
I think we're about to run out of time. So I just want to say that I hope very soon that book will be coming out too. And her other novel, which the title of the other novel was
Sweet of Silence.
Silence. I would like to see them all in English, and so if any publishers of translation are listening, because I would really love to have a chance to read them. I've gotten a chance to read them because you sent me the manuscripts, but I wish listening to this we get a chance to read them too.
And people can go to my website and read more about these books. I have pictures there. Ilse Duarte, literary-translator.com.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
In the Frances Tosquelles exhibition, and we want to start with a question for Carlos and Eddie to talk about the meaning of this exhibition here in New York City, but also in relation to your ongoing work, which included a stay earlier in the fall as the Catalan Studies visiting professor at New York University, where some of this research and information first was highlighted. But we also want to talk specifically about language, literature, and translation in relation to Tosquelles and his legacy in the history of psychiatry.
Definitely. This is an exhibition that translates a long-term research that I undertook in the 2011 when Catalonia Square was occupied by the Indignados movements. And then in 2018, I invited Joanna Massot also to join in because we had a lot of text to be translated by Tosquelles, considering that he was very well known in France, yet completely unknown in Catalonia. So this exhibition translates this long-term project, not only in literary terms, but also in cultural terms. Since Tosquelles was a figure originated in the Catalan Republic, in the Generalitat in the 30s, and then emigrated, exiled himself in France. So he's someone who went through a migration process. His own way of thinking, his sources will come from Central Europe in the 30s, from psychiatrists, psychoanalysts who were fleeing from Nazi persecution. So the project itself, it's about making Catalan culture international and translating it and packing it back into the New York audiences.
Yes, yeah, I think there's also a kind of conceptual translation going on where you may be wondering, why is this being hosted at the American Folk Art Museum? Well, much of the inspiration for the notion of art brut, which is a big key point in the history of the field of self-taught art, folk art, broadly construed, was inspired by the works of patient artists from Saint Alban, where Tosquelles was directing the hospital for over 20 years. And so we tried to trace like two sides of the same experience, to look at the object from different directions and see how this comes about differently if we approach it from the side of Tosquelles' institutional psychotherapy, less known in our field than the more art historical perspective associated with art brut.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question because we're in the first entryway of the exhibit that starts really in the 1930s. And I'm wondering if you can both talk a little bit about what's happening in Barcelona and Catalonia in the 1930s that is both specific to that cultural, political environment and Tosquelles' place within that, but also where Tosquelles was working, how he was thinking was also a bit of a nexus for international conversations around psychiatry, around kind of language, but also thinking about the kind of place of Barcelona in the 1930s in terms of cultural and politics.
Indeed, 1931, which is the very first year the Spanish Republic was declared, it will mark a brief moment of progressive practices, progressive politics, and Tosquelles is right in the middle of this process, benefiting from the fact that there are initiatives like Escola del Treball, led by Emili Mira López, who is the first chair in psychiatry and psychology in the University of Barcelona, and this young Tosquelles Tosquelles will not only benefit from a new institutional interest in psychology, in psychometrics, started by Eugène Dors and the Mancomunitat, generating and opening up the first labs to measure psychological aspects in human life. But Tosquelles will also participate in different conversations, like the translation and the first use it was made of Lacan's thesis in 1932 in the Hospital Pere Mata in Reus. So what we witness here is it's an enormous, a very intense moment of theories crisscrossing that will be very formative for Tosquelles himself, even though he's a staunch pragmatist and he will carry all his theories in his backpack, yet he will perform in a very situated way each time he's confronted with a crisis.
I think, yeah, something that attests to this pragmatism is the way in which the theoretical basis ends up being so multifaceted, because not only was he training as a psychiatrist, but he was very involved in political militancy at the time. And ultimately what this does is kind of cause him to conceive of the psychiatric questions he's approaching professionally from the standpoint of the general political situation there in the Second Republic, and then also to see this movement towards war that ultimately ended up happening as a kind of civilizational madness, as something. So he always emphasizes kind of twin alienations in his work, and this is kind of how his thought came about, I think, in the period.
Yeah. I wonder, before we move on to the next section, Eddie, you talked about politics and militancy, and Carlos, we've talked about this a lot. What is the role of the collective then, in terms of, at this early moment in the 1930s, but also how Tosquelles' ideas evolve? Because it seems like the idea of the collective in particular resonated with that first moment of your discovery of Tosquelles in the plaza during a collective action, and feels like something that makes Tosquelles' insights into individual psychology and the collective very relevant for today.
Yeah, we have a race. We are at race here when mythologizing Tosquelles' figure, because he seems an individual who sees, who interprets historical situations in a very clear way. But the truth is that he belongs to a rather dialogical situation in which many other intellectuals, theories, activists are there present, and this will be the motto of his life. He's the sign, the symptom of a collective situation wherever he goes. And I like to think of him as a sort of a human resources manager who is capable of bringing out the best skills in each one in order to overcome critical moments, critical situations. So he's really translating madness from being an individual pathology into collective pathology. This is like the first thing. But then he will also consider ways of curing this collective pathology within the context of an institution, and not just in a one-to-one relationship with, a doctor. So his main therapeutical device will definitely be the Patients Club, a construction very much inspired by the cooperativist experience in Catalonia in the late 20s and 30s, a civil society who's trying to give to itself the means to have health assistance systems and many other needs.
So I would love for us to talk now about what I see as some of the central artifacts in this exhibition, which is the written word, the records, the correspondence. How is it that the written word becomes an archive for Tosquelles' practice, but also what was the role of the written word in that psychiatric practice at St. Albans, but also now as curators of the show, how have you been able to use these written records as a kind of way of reconstructing? And if we could think about that in relation to also the cinematic, because the film and the film archive also seems to relate to how you were able to reconstruct some of this written archive, and conversely, how the film and the archive work together to create, as you were saying, a kind of demythologizing view into Tosquelles and his practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because when you want to explain what was going on inside of a psychiatric hospital like the one in Sant Alban, where Tosquelles worked for 2 decades in between the 40s and the 50s, you realize that there's not a single media that can cover everything that happened there. Of course, from a classical point of view, you think of letters, of books, of periodicals, which they all existed, and they have been of great help to understand what they were thinking, what they were doing. But at the same time, we have films shot by Tusquelles, which by no means are documenting the reality. They are rather a media extension of what, technically speaking, it's called birth transference. So it is the therapeutical relationship that allows everybody to participate in a therapeutical process. And at the same time, here in the exhibition, we have a great chance to see some samples of our brood, a terrible term because it refers to objects that have been extracted from the daily economy of the hospital. Thus, inside of the hospital, these were not artworks, these were objects subject to exchange value. So you have to come up with all these different forms of discourse, writing, or ways of creating a narrative about whatever happened inside of the hospital, one of the most opaque and inaccessible places.
I wonder too, because you mentioned the objects and we're standing in front of a vitrine that has some really important documents. Could you comment specifically on what it is that we're looking at, what these letters represent, and also what role does your work as curators play in putting this kind of history on display? Because I think there's a very different way of encountering these when they've been reproduced in books. And also speak a little bit perhaps about how this exhibit and this literature fit within what I think is becoming like Tusquelles studies a bit, that there are a number of scholars who are working in French comparative literature, the history of psychiatry, who have, I think, landed on Tusquelles as a really kind of flashpoint in the history of this. But underlying it, we need these kind of historical records to tell that story.
Definitely. When you want to tell a story, you really have to have some materials to hold onto, some material-based factual events to relate to. And Tusquelles is not trustworthy, because when he tells his life, he's a little bit delusional. He really goes and tells you, he's a real storyteller. And because of that, he's fantastic. And he gives himself the right to be as delusional as some of his patients, which is completely right. But then you have, as a researcher, to confront these statements and see what is this factual and what it is not factual. Here we have, for example, letters from Antonin Artaud to his mother in 1943, and this is a terrible moment in the history of France because there is shortage of food because of the Nazi occupation. So patients in hospitals will die by thousands, and this will only be known 40 years later in 1980, which is very shameful for a society to discover these dramatic events so lately. Yet, and this reveals also the difficulties in terms of research. You want to access a complex situation like the one in the hospitals, psychiatric hospitals in the 40s, and you will not get deep into the subject because the hospital is in itself an institution blocking public access. But of course, I mean, this is becoming a sort of a field of research in itself. And as I said before, Tusquelles is not the only name here. There are many others. Indeed, Antonin Artaud in 1947, he was not only overviewed by Gaston Verdier, a well-known French psychiatrist, he was treated by Josep Solanes, a comrade of Tusquelles. Yet Josep Solanes is not that well known, except for the work that Maripaz Balibres is starting to do in a very kind of constructive way. So it is a story revealing every time layers and layers that we were not aware of. And you are completely right, Jordana. I mean, this is becoming a vast field of research, which is not just for the sake of history, but is for the sake of an all articulation, complex relationship between politics, culture, and clinic.
I wonder, in thinking about this section, could we go back to last fall when you were at NYU as a visiting professor in Catalan studies, and you and Eddie and Camille really had a kind of beautiful conversation in which you screened some of the films and you also spoke about your research. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about what was that research that you shared, which I know is a bit of a preview for the show. And also, Eddie, if you could share a little bit about how this research relates to your own research and perhaps bringing Camille's alienation work in terms of France into it would be really helpful, I think, for people who are also New York City based, given that, Carlos, you were here for a bit and Eddie and Camille are also here working. It feels like a little bit of a nucleus for that exchange that we got to have a little bit of a snapshot in last fall.
Yeah, I was so lucky to be able to present my research at the KJCC as I was visiting professor in Catalan studies at the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. And what I attempted to do was not to explain the marvelous life of Tosquelles, but rather to construct a topography instead of biography, because the places are really, truly determinant for Tosquelles' practices. You have to imagine that he goes from the most flamboyant Modernista hospital in Reus to the frontline on the war, and then the concentration camp, and then a Direlic hospital, castle in Paris. So how can you imagine someone being able to go through all those different physical spaces and yet do the most interesting psychiatry? Of course, what they presented to also prevent any sort of, scientific kind of, pride is to present the films that Tosquelles shot during the early 50s. And, with silent film, you don't know who is in front there in the camera. You don't know where they are. You don't know their names unless you use artificial intelligence, or else a lot of time to identify these faces, the places, the dates. But this is great because then you have to be always vigilant. It keeps you hesitant about what you're looking at. And it means that it will be a long and enduring research until you get to say something decently coherent about those images. So I'm trying to concentrate my own research on the use of media by Tosquelles throughout his life. Early in his career in Reus, he was editor of a periodical called Studies, edited by the Centro de Lectura de Reus, which was just across his house. Then in that periodical, he will include articles on anti-war, vegetarianism, mental health, music, etc., etc., etc. Then he filmed in the 50s. Then in the 60s, when he went back to Reus, he used recorded tapes to conduct what he called the institutional analysis group by inviting many doctors to sit around a tape recorder and analyze their daily practice, their daily practice. So Tosquelles will respond, and this will generate a massive archive of tapes. So you always see the use of media as some sort of an extension of the institutional psychotherapy, which is not confined to the one-to-one encounter.
Yeah. You had mentioned topography, and I think it's related to some of my own projects and the things I'm most interested in about Tosquelles and the whole Saint Alban experience, because in a way it's a significant literary event, the whole history of Saint Alban, insofar as so much of the treatments that Tosquelles had developed were oriented towards, they were psychoanalytically inspired, which is to say they deal fundamentally with speech, but he was really oriented towards like the limits of speech. So often there's this recourse to writing, whether in the case of artists and political dissidents who were hiding at Saint Alban who could not speak in these moments, founding printing presses at Saint Alban and in the nearby region, and also these attempts to aim at treatment of basically like sort of pre-linguistic or rather asignifying psychiatric or clinical structures where, for example, Tosquelles, like Deligny, was concerned with tracing these ambulations and movements. And I think this sort of link between movement and writing, and very topographical in the sense of the land and tracing, is something that seems unique to Tosquelles' work and the Saint Alban experience. At the same time, you have if this sort of, I come out of a psychoanalytic background, so signification is fundamentally then related to speech in this sense, as Tosqué is too from psychoanalytic background. But I think you get these very different sort of terrains where that emerge from looking at even the same objects, like many of the artworks we have on display here at the museum were something that emerged out of the kind of wartime economy that developed in Saint Alban, a matter of necessity. They were exchanged like any other objects that the asylum village was exchanging in interaction with the surrounding inhabitants of Saint Alban and the Lozère region. But then for Jean Dubuffet, when he comes in, he sees a very different series of relations between this work and sees it as an artwork. And so in a way, you get these very different ways of conceiving the relation of these objects to the world. Another thing, chains of signification, if you want to be technical. But I think there's some very interesting things going on at Saint Alban apropos of speech and writing that more research remains to be done.
Carlos, could you talk to us a little bit about the intersection of Tosqués with what we could think of as the history of literature and writing during the period, and especially the kind of people who passed through St. Albans? I think the history of St. Albans within the history of psychiatry and the history of art and literature is really important, and especially during these war years. It feels like it was a very porous environment with people passing in and out. And in the exhibit, you featured several examples in particular. And if you could talk to us a little bit about those.
Yeah, Saint Alban is such an incredible place, and probably because of Tosquelles, because he really attracted all these different names. Mostly in 1943, in the winter, when Paul Éluard and Nouge ended up there, escaping from France, from Paris, which was taken by the Nazi troops, and Paul Éluard had just published the poem Liberté. So he went to hide in the hospital among the patients, but years later, a couple of years later, for example, Tristan Tzara ended up there after once finished the war with his son. So in Saint Alban, we see how two important books from those years were written and conceived. One is Souvenirs de la Maison de Fou, Memories of the Mouth House, and the other one by Tzara that was illustrated nonetheless by Joan Miró, is Parler Seul, Speaking Alone, or Speaking by Herself. Both books are, again, very problematic because they render the surrealist fascination with female characters, deranged women who find themselves isolated, stranded in the world, and have no hope to survive the misery they live in. So these books became kind of very iconic for what the life was in there. But the truth is that there were other patients writing letters, writing texts, sometimes very delusional, like La Marianne writing to Hitler and demanding Hitler to take her out from the hospital because she was being mistreated there. But there were also writings in the periodical, Trait d'Union, hyphen, which means connection. And in there, Tosquelles, Fanon, and patients would coexist along the pages of that periodical. So it makes an interesting place, Saint Alban. I always like saying in a bit of say it's like the Bauhaus in a madhouse. So it really a place that concentrates a lot of modern innovations that all trickle down to a new lifestyle, a new social organization.
Carlos, in this one of the last two sections of the show, you bring in together the history of Catalonia with really a history of decolonization. And I think following up on the theme about St. Albans as a place of kind of encuentro, no, of togetherness, I think many people would be surprised that Frantz Fanon was also there and had a really strong connection with Tosquelles. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you've learned so far about their relationship, what's still to be discovered about their relationship, but also how impactful it is to think through Fanon, the value perhaps of psychiatry and thinking through questions of race in this time. And also, I think the legacy of that relationship into the present, as people can still today cite Fanon and the writings about Fanon in terms of race as being extraordinarily important.
Right. I think that the encounter between Fanon and Tosquelles, which took place in April 1952 for the first time, when Fanon finished his medical studies in Lyon and went to work to Saint Alban, because Tosquelles was strongly reputed already by the time, and got there with the hope to learn about institutional psychotherapy, a new way of dealing with pathologies of freedom. And Fanon and Tosquelles went hand in hand to work on a way to recover people from their shocks and drive them into the ways of conducting therapy along the lines of institutional psychotherapy. So for me, the interesting aspect of this collaboration is the fact that on the one hand, Fanon is the leader, the future leader of decolonization, but he's learning his métier, his job in a psychiatric hospital next to Tosquelles, who is a Spaniard, a Republican exile, a political loser. So the pathologies that come from racial discrimination and the pathologies that come from losing politically, from losing your country, your connections with your civil society, with your family, with your country, I think they are not so distant one from each other, even though the contemporary studies have segregated them. So I think that very soon we will be reading Tosquelles and Fanon closely together in order to better understand what catalyzed the incredible Fanon's critique of racism. And there are important aspects to be recuperated, because Tosquelles was committed with the Rabasaido Revolution in the 30s, which is the peasants' revolution, and for Fanon was very instrumental to understand the rural culture, the peasants' culture around the hospital in Blida. So we will be coming across coincidences and concomitances which will be very revealing in order to better understand what decolonialism is.